From Colorado.
I thank the chairman and thank the witnesses and have no questions.
The gentlelady from New Mexico.
Thank you so very much, and thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Representative. So I would like to enter into the record, Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter of opposition to Republicans' attempts to overturn the Department of Labor's joint employer rule. The letter is co-signed by 72 labor and workers' rights organizations representing tens of millions of American workers.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. And I think what this letter signifies as it writes down and what we heard from Representative Rights is the fact that it is so important to make sure that workers are able to enforce their rights, that they're able to unionize, that they're able to protect their rights, regardless of whatever shell games may be played by contractors. And so with that, I will yield back unless there is anything that you would like to add to this, Representative Wild.
I'd like to just comment on the question asked by Representative Norman. I think it's very important to note that the joint employer rule requires that the two employers share or co-determine one or more of the employee's essential terms and conditions of employment. So this is not a situation where a McDonald's, for instance, franchise has to necessarily be considered a joint employer, the franchisor and the franchisee, because if the franchisee makes the determination that certain employees are going to work certain hours, that they're going to, remember the franchise relationship, which is where most of the criticism usually comes from, is modeled on the idea that the successful franchisor brand is followed through in the franchisee's place of business. So they want to make sure that it looks like all of the other franchises. They want to make sure that it's kept clean and orderly and that the quality of the food, if that's involved, is standard. They are not going to be getting involved in things like what hours you determine employee X or employee Y may work. You would not be a joint employer in that situation. And so I think that it's a myth to think that all of a sudden we're going to see nothing but joint employers everywhere, because the small business owner, in this case a franchisee, which is a small business most of the time, although some franchisees own hundreds of franchises, is still able to control the essential conditions of his or her workers' employment.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure. I'll yield.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentleman. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I share the same frustration as my colleagues up here. It's like, here we go again. A week of Republican futility. This Congress, as we say over and over again, is the least productive Congress since the Depression, and given some of the laws that they keep putting before us, thank heaven for that. And why? Because what we keep seeing in this Rules Committee and on the floor of the House is what I'm trying to figure out, what is it? And it is that there is a constant attempt to foment anger, division, acrimony. They have division, but no vision. Because if they had vision, they'd actually want to try to solve the problems that we have. We don't have an open border. Our ranking member just talked about the numbers, the thousands and thousands and tens of thousands that are incarcerated, that are deported on a regular basis. And Mr. McClintock, in your presentations, you've talked about cartels. These bills have nothing to do with the cartels, but I would assume you would be, given your concern about this, in favor of vital supplemental requests, which we're not going to even hear on the floor, I would imagine. But I'm assuming you would be in favor of 1,000 additional CBP field officers to help staff our ports of entry.
You know,
I would assume that you'd be in favor of $23.2 million for the DEA so we can do more around fentanyl tracing and enforcement. Another $1.4 billion for our shelter and services programs so we could address these things. These are things I think actually make a difference. But none of the bills we're seeing here today actually do this. Instead, as we're hearing, again, there is an effort to actually address the border crisis. I'm not sure I'm in favor of it because we haven't actually seen what it looks like. But we've already seen on the House side that it's being killed. Why? Because Trump has said, kill it. It's better for me politically if you kill this deal, and I will happily take the blame for it. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record an article titled GOP Senator, it is, open quote, immoral, close quote, to kill the border deal to help Trump.
Objections so ordered.
You know, it is striking what's in this. Senator Tom Tillis, who we pointed out is Republican, says, it is immoral for me to think you look the other way because you think this is a linchpin for President Trump to win. Strong words. Senator Mitt Romney called the effort to kill the bill, open quote, appalling. He noted that there is an issue at the southern border and needs to be fixed. We had Senator Todd Young calling the efforts to disrupt the negotiations as tragic. Senator Tillis again saying it would take courage for members to actually move ahead and get this done. Courage. Courage. What we keep hearing in this Rules Committee and in this Republican-controlled House is outrage. Talk about things that then don't get fixed by the bills before us, but sadly not courage. What I think it would take courage to do is if in these bills we actually did something that made a difference. I see Representative Garcia, who is going to testify about the need to have an amendment to these bills so we could have the Dream and Promise Act. That would take courage to actually do something that Americans want us to do, which is make sure that deferred action for children actually happens so that we could reap the economic benefits that these children are providing to our country, recognizing the economic benefits that dreamers bring to us, which would be actually courage to do something right and do something that's consistent with what American people need and is so needed by our economy and is, instead of being immoral, the morally right thing to do. I don't know, Ranking Member, if you have any further thoughts about this or wanted to answer any of the other issues that have been raised.
No, I think we've gone through much of it. We're dealing with messaging bills, with hypocrisy, with a political party that doesn't want to solve the problem because it wants the problem for the general election, although various Republican senators, that's not a fair description of them, but it's certainly a fair description of our former president and apparently of the House Republicans. There's not much else that can be said. The specifics of these bills I've already criticized, but the specifics are almost unimportant because we know these bills are going nowhere and are intended to go nowhere.
But more importantly, they actually don't fix the problem that the larger issues that have been raised today in bold headlines like this is happening, but none of these bills actually do that. There is, and so that's the thing, is that we need to have the kind of courage to recognize that we need to fix the system, to recognize also the economic benefits that would come to us if we fix the system. We need to do, as my colleague mentioned, go in and invest in the countries where we're sending migrants up here, because until we do that, we have to stop the flow. We need to help people stay where they would prefer to stay, which is in their home country. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady.
Lady from New Mexico is recognized for any questions you may have for the panel.
Thank you, Chairman. So we're back here again with extreme Republican politics of grievance and acrimony, chaos over governance. So What I want to do, though, is make sure that we don't become numb to this kind of behavior and to this kind of legislating. Because we must condemn political vengeance and Trump's desire for political revenge every single time it rears its ugly head. You know, when MAGA Marjorie Taylor Greene, as you pointed out, files 10 impeachment proceedings and censure motions, we should say no. Reasonable Republicans should say no. And indeed, as our ranking member pointed out, reasonable Republicans have said no. Former Homeland Security Secretary, as you pointed out, said that the Republicans have failed to put forth evidence that meets the bar. Ken Buck, one of your colleagues, said this is a policy difference. Over and over again, we're hearing that there is a distinction and policy differences do not rise to what the Constitution calls for with impeachment. And to talk about unworthy men is precisely an issue that then James Madison went on to define. So I would point out that after that discussion was had, there was an attempt to say maladministration. So we don't like your policy, right? Maladministration should be a cause for impeachment. So, you know, Chairman Green, your point about unworthy, James Madison himself argued against allowing maladministration or policy differences for being a point of impeachment. He said, James Madison, and I would quote this, as he sought to defeat that Constitutional Convention amendment, he said, that would be equivalent, quote unquote, equivalent to a tenure doing pleasure of the Senate. There was indeed an effort to make sure there was a separation of powers. So as our ranking member Thompson pointed out, if you don't like what they're doing, take them to court. If you don't like what they're doing, there are remedies unless it is treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. So the Constitutional Convention rejected a vague standard of simply unworthy, and instead, you know, I would hope that my reasonable Republicans would also reject this attempt. And I think it is very different than what we've pointed out has happened before. Ranking Member Thompson, I need to tell you that I am so grateful for the work that you did as chair of the January 6th committee, because you shone a bright light for all Americans to see on prime time and in detail how close we came, how close the insurrectionists came to the members of Congress, some of whom are sitting here today, and our staff, how close we came to allowing a president who had lost an election, who knew he had lost election, from staying in power. And I know from watching you in those hearings how much you believe in our democracy, how much you have worked, as you pointed out, during your entire tenure. The entire time there's been a Homeland Security Committee, you've been on it. So share with us a bit of what you see when you look at what happened around January 6th and how close we came there and what we're looking at now with this Mayorkas impeachment.
Well, thank you very much. I think that there are sharp differences between this sham impeachment and the work of the bipartisan January 6th Select Committee. The Select Committee uncovered actual crimes committed by the former president. In fact, he's facing trial for some of them in federal court and in Georgia right now. Those are clearly impeachable offenses. Republicans cannot allege that Secretary Mayorkas has committed any particular crime, let alone a high crime and misdemeanor. Instead, they're relying on vague and poorly written charges. The other comment I make is that in reviewing Secretary Mayorkas' enforcement guidelines that was referred to earlier, the Supreme Court recognized that setting immigration enforcement guidelines is necessary and common, they sided with Secretary Mayorkas 8-1. So they're saying you have to use the discretion of the secretary to administer the laws. It's not a, here it is. You have to do the best you can with it. And it's that discretion that the court says the secretary has, and it continues to rule in that favor. So again, there's no bribery alleged against Secretary Mayorkas. There's no documented high crime or misdemeanor, as we have had in other impeachment settings. So again, it's people saying we're going to impeach him and not using any facts that will hold up in a court of law. Obviously, the impeachment will go through the House, and if it passes, it'll go to the Senate. But it's so unfortunate that the last time we even brought it up was 148 years ago. And here we are at this point, 148 years later, with what a lot of us think is, in fact, a sham impeachment. We can work it out as Democrats and Republicans, but the die was already cast before we even considered any of the other so-called charges. One of the things I can tell you, I offered a simple amendment that the secretary be afforded due process. And I was ruled out of order. And then I offered an amendment in the markup, and it was defeated. I mean, that's how we, as a country, got to our greatness, is assuming that everyone has an opportunity, not just to face his or her accuser, but also have an opportunity to provide a defense. We made that effort to just set some ground rules consistent with the rules of every other impeachment hearing, and it was failed. So it was clear when due process failed in the markup, I knew democracy was in trouble.
Democracy was in trouble. And I think that that's part of the concern, is that when we are using impeachment process rather than elections, policy issues are for elections, that we are using this impeachment process for something it's not intended. And, the chairman referenced the Belknap impeachment. Bribery. What was the real reason why Belknap was impeached? It was bribery, is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Are you asking me?
Bribery.
Actually, the third article was his failure to do his job.
Well, but.
There were
wasn't
3
the-
articles of impeachment on him. There were crimes, you're right.
Right.
But
What-
clearly,
can
our
you-
founders
can you
did
share
not
with-
intend
can you
for it
share
to be
with-
just
Can you share with
crimes.
us? Can you share with us what the crimes were?
Bribery.
Bribery. So in that instance, he was getting a cut from a trader, is that correct? And
Well,
he was living a lavish lifestyle, big parties, had
doubt.
lots more money than his salary would have intended?
No doubt.
Yeah, so he was engaged in bribery.
He was. He did
engaged in
engage in
bribery.
a crime, but they also put a third article on there for failing to do his job.
But the real issue was bribery.
And President Nixon didn't commit a crime himself, but had several impeachment articles against him for being dishonest and for not following the law.
So, but as we know, I mean, using Belknap, who engaged in bribery, using President Nixon, who, while I actually agree with some of the actions President Nixon did as policy, amazingly, he did some very good things. I mean, to use Nixon as an example, when he resigned
I'm using the
in disgrace.
example of the impeachment people going against him, not Mr. Nixon.
Nixon resigned in
just to be
disgrace.
clear.
But I would ask, besides, so talking about bribery and the salaries, besides the salary as a public servant, did you receive any testimony that Secretary Mayorkas received any financial benefits, Chairman?
No, that's not in the article. The
Okay,
articles are
so-
about him violating the laws passed by Congress with his
And-
memos and other things.
Yeah.
That's not even in our article, so
Right.
no, of course not.
Well, yeah, of course not. There was nothing like that.
Yep.
Professor Deborah Pearlstein testified in her testimony, right, ranking member? She says offenses, impeachable offenses against the public trust are instances in which an official is willfully acting for his own benefit or his own power or foreign power. And she found no evidence of any financial benefit flowing for him, no political benefit. In fact, our ranking member has pointed out that this is a thankless job, that he took on a job for which he has been attacked daily out of his love of this country. So I'm struck by a floor speech from the Republican chairman of the Subcommittee on Immigration, Integrity, Security, Enforcement, Republican Tom Clintock, who described this attempt to impeach Secretary Mayorkas as a, open quote, perilous path. He said House Resolution 863 would, open quote, utterly destroy the separation of powers at the heart of our Constitution. Ranking Member Thompson, do you want to elaborate on why you think that this is so dangerous to the separation of powers?
Well, you know, the framers of our Constitution, as a number of people have indicated, they spent a lot of time putting this document together. And I think they respect the separation of powers. And so we make the laws. And after we make the laws, we pass them on ostensibly for the executive branch to carry forth. In this instance with the secretary, we don't give him enough resources to do a job, so he has to use whatever level that he can to address the problem. And so in trying to address the problem without the proper resources, he's doing the best job he can. But he's not breaking the law. He's just doing the best he can with the resources that Congress has provided. As I said, a majority of our committee who's had an opportunity to vote on provide more resources to the department have voted against providing resources. Now they want to impeach a man for not doing his job when you didn't give him the resources to do it.
So, to concur, when you say the majority, the Republicans have voted against providing Mayorkas with the resources necessary to do the job. Is that?
That's correct.
Yes. And as I understand, they've also refused to entertain the supplemental appropriations request sent to the Hill in October. And now, as we've heard, they're trying to sink the bipartisan Senate border bill because Trump told them, sink the bipartisan border bill.
Well, it's disingenuous to say the border is broken, and when opportunities to put resources to address those issues, you vote against them. And then we get word that the president, former president, is saying he's against the bipartisan bill, but he's for the impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas. None of that makes any sense. We have to put resources that our men and women need along the border. The technology is so important. It's a force multiplier for security. In order to do it, we have to invest in it. And at every opportunity, when we don't invest, we make that border a vulnerable situation. The secretary can only do with what the resources we provided.
Yes. So you keep saying it doesn't make any sense, but it does make a very crass political sense, is if you want to run on this and you want to have the chaos, because Republicans seem to run on chaos. But sadly, we actually do know what an impeachable offense looks like, because the American people lived through what evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors look like. We in this room lived through what evidence of high crimes and misdemeanor looked like when insurrectionists stormed the Capitol, threatened to hang Vice President Pence and kill Speaker Pelosi. They attacked us because Trump wanted to delay certification and, in essence, overturn the 2020 election. That violent attack on our democracy led to the death of 5 law enforcement officers and seriously injured 140 more officers. That's what an impeachable offense looks like. That's what high crimes and misdemeanors looks like. 179 Republicans voted against impeaching Trump for an insurrection that they witnessed firsthand as they ran for cover or barricaded themselves in their office. And I assume many of those same Republicans will vote for this sham and unprecedented impeachment of a cabinet member where there is no evidence of any financial harm or crime. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the January 30th, 2024 Wall Street Journal editorial board's article, "Impeaching Mayorkas Achieves Nothing. A policy dispute doesn't qualify as a high crime and misdemeanor."
Without objection.
So the op-ed points out that House Republicans, open quote, dislike how the administration is interpreting immigration law. But Congress has failed, close quote. So they point out that's Congress that has failed to reform our immigration laws. As we heard from our ranking member, it's Congress that has failed to provide for the resources that are needed. The op-ed goes on, and the Wall Street Journal is not seen by anybody as, I think, a liberal rag. It's a reputable journal, often described by some as conservative. I'm not taking a stand there. But they end with this sentence: grandstanding is easier than governing. And Republicans have to decide whether to accomplish anything other than impeaching Democrats. Grandstanding is easier than governing. I end where I began, that Republicans don't seem to be able to govern. Ranking member pointed out how little legislation has come out of this Congress, pointed out how little legislation has come out of Homeland Security. We need to get back to the business of bipartisan legislation that solves the problems rather than seeking to get camera clicks and impeachment articles written up where we know they're not going anywhere because there is nothing there. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we have seen the Republicans kill a lot of their rules, their own rules. A record number of rules, Republican rules, have been killed on the floor of the House. So I think it's a little too early to crow about getting this done when you don't know if you're going to get your Republican colleagues to vote for your own rule. But, you know, there's something else that's in this rule, and that's H Resolution 987. And my colleagues, they like complaining a lot. They have a politics of grievance, but they don't actually solve the problem. They go on and on about various issues, energy, immigration, other things, but they do not solve the problem. They don't actually pass laws. They don't take up the bills that actually would solve the problem. And that's what we're seeing today in HR Resolution 987. It's just a bill of complaint. And it's also not very accurate. They are complaining about President Biden's energy policies, but let's look at those energy policies. The United States is producing a record 13.2 million barrels of crude oil a day, more than Russia or Saudi Arabia, more than any time during the Trump administration. We're also producing record amounts of natural gas. I mean, HR 987 itself even notes that the U.S. became a global leader in LNG exports for the first time in 2023. which was under President Biden. Moreover, oil and gas companies are reaping the benefits. In the last 2 years, we've seen record profits, $196 billion one year and $123 billion the next. What we see a lot in this other resolution is complaining, but not a good recitation of facts on the ground. The resolution also complains that there isn't enough domestic production of reliable and affordable energy. Let's talk about affordable energy. When Democrats were in control last Congress, we and President Biden took historic action to spur clean energy development right here at home. We know that clean energy helps stabilize prices because we're not subject to international price fluctuations. As we've talked about earlier, as Representative Crow mentioned, one of the reasons we saw the surge in gas prices was because of Putin's war. And yet we're not taking up the bipartisan security package that passed overwhelmingly in the Senate. If we want to look at ways of making sure that our international markets don't go crazy, let's address Putin's war. They don't want to do that. But what we are doing at home is looking at that renewable energy, because when we produce renewable energy here at home, we're not dependent on Saudi Arabia. We're not dependent on Russia. President Biden knows the importance of energy independence, and we're creating that independence by weaning ourselves off of those international markets. Let me tell you, we're doing that in New Mexico. Because when we build in New Mexico, we build down costs. And what are we doing in New Mexico? Last year, the Inflation Reduction Act created more than 170,000 clean energy jobs, $369 billion. Some of that went to New Mexico. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples from our own beautiful state. It spurred $1.4 billion in funding for clean energy projects to create at least 2,105 jobs. In New Mexico, these clean energy jobs are also bringing to our state manufacturing jobs. Like in Belen, where we'll be building wind towers. For the first time, we are creating manufacturing jobs in the United States. Wind and power and solar are actually the cheapest electricity we can invest in. Our big companies know that, and they're investing in wind and solar. Indeed, I recently met with Chevron representatives, and they told me excitedly about the plans they have to invest in clean energy, to invest in wind and solar. So rather than pass a resolution that doesn't do anything but complain, I invite my Republican colleagues to work with Democrats to pass bills that bring down our energy costs while we invest in America's clean energy future here at home. Help us build on progress we made last Congress so that we can grow the middle class and lower costs for American people. We can achieve both goals when you put people over politics. I reserve.
The gentlewoman from New Mexico reserves. The gentleman.
Gentleman reserves. Without objection, the gentlewoman from New Mexico will control the time for the minority and is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from New York, Mr. Langworthy, for the customary 30 minutes. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Republicans called us into an emergency meeting to consider today's rules several weeks ago. Several weeks ago is an emergency. Actually, America does have some emergencies that need to be addressed. Our national security is at risk. Putin, the dictator, may win his war against our ally if we don't surge aid to Ukraine. Putin wants World War III, and Putin, protecting Republicans, don't want to address that emergency. Remember, Putin's war caused our energy prices to rise. I call on responsible Republicans to address our national security emergency. I call on them to address the bipartisan, overwhelmingly bipartisan bill that passed the Senate. America has another emergency. In 5 legislative days, count them, it's a single hand. In 5 legislative days, our federal government won't have money to pay its workers, to pay its contracts, to do our jobs. So today should be a day to govern, a day to address America's emergencies. Instead, we are taking up one of the most precious resources we have in Congress, and that is floor time, for an election ploy to help certain New York Republicans win their next election. Last night, New Yorkers told America they were tired of Republicans' failure to govern, didn't they? Now, Republicans are using floor time to save the fragile re-election campaigns of some other New York Republicans. But don't let them fool you. H.R. 7160 is simply a Band-Aid for a problem that the twice impeached, 4 times indicted former President Trump and Republican congressional folks caused in the first place. They created this problem that they now want to put a Band-Aid on. They capped the SALT deduction in their tax bill to give tax breaks to the wealthiest corporations and CEOs. As we know, Republicans and Trump seem to care more about the richest Americans. There are real emergencies that all Americans want this Congress to address. The federal government could shut down in just 2 weeks, an absolute disaster that these bills don't even mention. That should be our priority. Yet we have another week of chaos and dysfunction of dealing with things that are not priorities for the American people. It's another week that Republicans allow small sections of their party to dictate what we see on the floor based on their re-election priorities. It's another week that extreme MAGA Republicans push partisan political stunts. The other bill in this rule is another one of those stunts. H.R. Resolution 987 is a non-binding, politically motivated resolution that does nothing, nada, nothing, to lower energy costs or provide effective energy solutions. Like so much of what Republicans do in the House, it's a distraction from the real bipartisan work Congress must do. And from the first paragraph, it's wrong. Just yesterday, we got a new Consumer Price Index report which shows energy prices fell last month. They have fallen 4.6% in the last year. The United States is producing more oil than ever before, more than any time during the Trump administration. More importantly, energy is not just oil and gas. The Inflation Reduction Act that Democrats passed and President Biden signed into law last Congress created more than 170,000 clean energy jobs in the U.S. so far. Wind, solar, geothermal, these are important elements of our American energy portfolio. The Inflation Reduction Act provided $369 billion in investments for clean energy and for reducing greenhouse gas pollution. This resolution that does nothing is just wrong. Do nothing. It's a do-nothing Congress. It's a yet another day in our do-nothing Congress. And let's not take our word for it. In the first session of the 117th Congress, 81 bills had been enacted into law. In the first session of the Republican-led 118th Congress, 34 bills. That's all, just 34 bills. One of the most unproductive Congresses in modern history. The American people deserve more. They want more. They want us to do our work. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no on the rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserve.
The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
You know, we just have to keep saying it over and over again. How dare you scold us for not fixing a problem that you created, and how dare you scold us? How dare you actually even think about when you don't want to fix the problem? Your fix needs fixing, and let's move on. I was like flabbergasted when I heard my colleague say that the Trump tax cuts, which benefited the wealthy and the super wealthy and the millionaires and billionaires, that they were the greatest stimulus ever. They were actually not. I'd like to enter into a record. The Biden tax proposals would correct inequities created by Trump tax cuts and raise additional revenues, and a chart called with total real revenues 2014-2018 Brookings Institute.
Without objection.
What these show is that it wasn't the greatest stimulus. Indeed, that with the Trump tax cuts, revenue plummeted from expected. Those Trump tax cuts are the reason we have the deficits, which is what they always usually complain about. Mr. Speaker, I would ask whether my colleague's ready to close. Mr. Speaker, it's clear, Right. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that today's legislative calendar highlights the very distinct differences in priorities and values between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats, we're committed to putting people over politics. We're dedicated to lowering costs for everyday Americans, to raising the middle class, to growing that middle class, and to investing in our communities. On the other hand, Republicans don't have much of an agenda other than chaos and trying to win the next election. The Salt Marriage Penalty Elimination Act is a Band-Aid on a wound that Republicans inflicted on the American people when they passed the Trump tax cuts. It's not the kind of emergency that should be taking up our time when we don't have a budget, when we can't pay our bills in a couple of weeks, when we have Putin possibly winning a war in Ukraine. But here we are, taking that up and taking up a non-binding resolution about President Energy's policies that ignore how much we've invested in clean energy, how many jobs we created in the energy sector, and how we are lowering prices. That's putting people and our planet first. Their non-binding resolution does nothing. Republicans keep taking up our time, doing nothing on this House floor. We should be on the House floor this week talking about funding the government. The American people deserve more than the political stunts and the partisan gridlock that comes out of this wonderful, beautiful people's house. This people's house where last Congress we got so much done. We invested in our infrastructure. We invested in our communities. We saved America from the economic catastrophe that we were facing coming out of that pandemic. We did so much then, and we've done so little now. What contrast. But in the face of chaos and dysfunction, I and everybody in my Democratic caucus remain steadfast in our commitment to progress and prosperity for all Americans. The bills that we will be taking up if this rule passes, they keep defeating their rules. They won't be doing that. A teeny tiny little Band-Aid on a big open wound. This rule is all about politics and not about people. Let's reject the rule and put people over politics. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose the previous question and the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentlelady from New Mexico recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Pasquarelli made a really important point, and that is that this problem arose and it impacted middle-class Americans. But that happened because Republicans and the Trump tax cuts didn't really much care about middle-class Americans. They didn't much care about working-class Americans. And in fact, as we know, the Trump tax cuts mostly benefited the wealthy. The Trump tax cuts highlight the priorities that we see on this chamber between Republicans and Democrats. Because they imposed the SALT deduction cap for a reason. They wanted to make sure that they could pass these tax cuts that, as you can see, benefited the richest Americans, so much more than they did middle-class Americans. It is just a magnitude that is astounding. So their goal of what they tried to do and what they did do back then worked. The top 0.1% had an average tax cut of $193,000. And what kind of cut did middle-income Americans receive? A paltry $930. If you earned $3 million or more a year, you got to keep an extra $193,000. People who earned $1 billion got to keep even more. Do those millionaires and billionaires really need that help? You know who really needed that help? The middle class, who got $930. That's barely $77 a month. These were their priorities. These remain their priorities, except for the fact that there are some election problems happening over there in New York, and they acknowledged it. New York, a few of the New York Republicans helped them get their majority, and so this is what they're getting back for 1 year. 1 year only, because they didn't want to vote for a 2-year fix. So, you know, imagine what a middle-class family would have been able to do if they could have gotten thousands of dollars of tax cut. They would have been able to do some of the things we're talking about: buy a house, send their kids to college, go on a vacation, make sure that they didn't have to worry about the bills. 20 years of groceries they could have bought if we just allowed them to get what the rich got. But that didn't happen, because Democrat priorities, we're always standing with the working class and not the wealthiest corporations and CEOs. We want to lower costs and grow the middle class. So HR 7160, you know, it's not solving the problem. It's not a permanent fix. It's not even a 2-year fix. So when you guys get up and complain about that this should not be a problem for us, we wanted to fix it for 2 years. You said no. They just don't want to let us vote on things that are important. They don't want to let us vote on a 2-year fix. They don't want to let us vote on Ukraine funding, on emergency security issues that are about protecting our troops. Let us vote on these issues. Let the House members have a say. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Republicans' fix needs a fix. Really. They are proposing, instead of actually fixing the salt problem, they keep trying to say, oh, it's all right for us to do just a teeny tiny little bit, just as long as we can get reelected, right? Because if they really wanted to fix it, they would have at least, one, taken it up in Ways and Committee and had a good debate and brought it to the floor with a robust fix that actually makes a difference, not just for an election year. I might remind everybody again, in the Rules Committee, we had Joe Neguse, a member of the Rules Committee, proposed that this SALT fix actually go for 2 years so that it would be consistent with the other tax cuts that Trump did. They didn't want that. The other thing that the amendment does was strike 20,000 and have 30,000. They didn't want that either. Every single Republican voted against it. Every single Republican voted against having this go for 2 years. Why? Because that wasn't part of the deal. They don't need it after November, I guess. They only need this for November, is that it? Once November goes by, your constituents don't need another year of tax relief with regards to this deduction? Why would you vote against that? I have no idea why they would not let the members on the floor of the House decide whether this bill should go for 2 years. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve. Unanimous consent to address the floor of the House and to extend and revise my remarks.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Recently, Speaker Johnson and most House Republicans co-sponsored a bill that could ban IVF nationwide and criminalize reproductive health care. The Alabama Supreme Court's anti-IVF ruling is consistent with these extreme attempts to steal women's freedom to decide when, how, and if to have a family. Trump and the MAGA extremists want a federal abortion ban. Packing the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade wasn't enough for them. Every state law and constitutional amendment protecting women's reproductive freedoms, from New Mexico to Kansas to Ohio, could be overturned if Donald Trump and Republicans win in 2024. Criminalizing pregnancies, outlawing IVF and birth control, forcing pregnancies on children who've been raped. That's the nightmare we face unless women and those that love them act now to defeat this extremism. Women need health care, not handcuffs. I yield back.
For what purposes is
Lady from New Mexico is recognized for any questions she may have of the panel.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. A few weeks ago, I stood with my colleagues on the House floor. I stood and I listened, and I thought it was appropriate to stand and grieve and listen to the pain. Like our ranking member, my children are the same age, 25 and 23, my 3 children in college. And so it is hard to hear of the loss of somebody so promising. And it is proper that we recognize that pain. And we have so much of that pain across this country. You know, so often, I have stood on the floor of the House and myself stood up to recognize those we have lost. In that instance, it was for a mass killing where numerous guns were used, automatic weapons. I've stood with friends of mine as their constituents were lost to natural disasters, to other mass murders. And it is our job to look at these horrific events and say, what can we do? And so I recognize that urge to try to do something in the face of loss. But like, I think that the important thing to do is to be careful about what we do and to do it in a thoughtful manner and to do so in a way that recognizes what can be done and what will be effective. I am struck by the fact that this bill has no funding, and I'm struck by the fact that ranking member pointed out that we already have policies for detention, but we don't fund the Homeland Security so that there would be enough detention. I'm struck by the fact that you could get arrested for any kind of misdemeanor and would face that detention, whether or not you were ever charged or not, and by the testimony with regards to what does that mean for people's civil liberties. I'm struck by the fact that there was a border bill. Ranking member, was the Senate bipartisan legislation, would you describe that as something intended to address issues at the border?
It was certainly intended to address the problems at the border. That was its purpose. Most of the Republicans who talked about an open border voted for it. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump, former President Trump, said in so many words, and our colleague, Mr. Nels, said in so many words that that bill shouldn't be adopted by the House because it would solve the problem, and we don't want to solve the problem. We want an election issue, not a solution to the problem. And that's why that bill hasn't been taken up yet.
Yes, so it strikes me that those who care a lot about this issue would be supportive of bringing bipartisan solutions and working together across the aisle on bipartisan solutions.
It is a bipartisan bill. It's a very harsh bill, frankly. I'm not sure I would vote for it.
Yeah.
It's a very harsh bill, and more harsh than the bill that was last considered by the so-called Gang of Eight in 2013, which is 11 years ago, which is the last serious attempt to deal with this problem. as I said, that was the last serious attempt to deal with this problem until this bill, and of course, what we see from our Republican colleagues, not all of them, because
No,
some of
in
them
the
are in
House.
Senate.
I mean, Republicans in the Senate described it as one of the strongest border bills that they
Yes,
had
they did.
already worked on.
And what we see from our colleagues in the House is that they'd rather have the issue than a very, in my opinion, very harsh, and the Republican senator's description, very strong border bill.
So Trump said, do not take up that bill because it will not be good for my reelection. And so instead of addressing the issues at the border, by actually taking up the bill and looking at what things we could do over here, it was, as our speaker said, dead on arrival. I also want to, Mr. Chair, seek unanimous consent to enter into the record an article called "The Truth About Illegal Immigration and Crime."
Without objection.
And, you know, as we look at this, covers numerous studies that show that actual immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, actually have lower rates of crime because they are very concerned about not threatening their ability to stay in this country. So, you know, I'd encourage my colleagues to review this. And this man deserves to have the harshest penalties available as he's convicted. And I think that that is key, and that is also possible. There is nothing in the present law that will prevent that. There is nothing in the present law that will prevent his deportation, as I understand it, once as he is convicted. And so I think that that's something that's important to remember. Ranking Member Nadler.
That's correct. I just want to point out, in light of what you were just talking about, a study from Stanford last year, Stanford University pointed out that the last time immigrants had a higher incarceration rate than native-born Americans, than native-born citizens, was 1870. Today, immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than native-born citizens. Between 1990 and 2013, the undocumented immigration population more than tripled from 3.5 to 11.2 million, but FBI data indicates that the violent crime rate declined 48% in that period.
And if they are convicted, they are deportable. Is that correct, Mr.
Absolutely. If they're convicted, they are deported.
And they
The
should be.
problem with this bill, with a number of bills that we've seen, is that an arrest or a charge gets someone put in permanent detention. Even an arrest when no one is ever charged. And that's just un-American.
Well, once again, I do believe that the perpetrator deserves to face the consequences and under our laws. And I am very saddened by this loss of life. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Speaker, this weekend, Oppenheimer is expected to win multiple Oscars. In the film, we watch the pain and guilt in J.R. Oppenheimer's face when he heard what the atomic bomb did to the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What the film didn't show, and the story that remains untold, is how thousands of New Mexican families were exposed to harmful amounts of radiation. We didn't see how radioactive ash rained down on children, families, and farms from that first atomic bomb tested in New Mexico. We didn't see the tears and pain as those families saw their loved ones die of cancers and rare diseases tied to radiation exposure. So I want to present this film one more award. The award for the most incomplete story, for the countless American lives lost as a result of the Trinity test. But Congress can write a better ending to this story. A bipartisan coalition of senators and representatives, we have amendments to the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which would finally compensate New Mexico downwinders and uranium workers, as well as workers in Missouri, Alaska, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and downwinders in other states who were left out of that original Radiation Compensation Act. Earlier this year, these amendments were included in the NDAA as passed by the Senate. Sadly, Republican leadership, for some inexplicable reason, stripped these amendments from the final NDAA. But today, soon, Congress can write a happier ending. We can now include it in our future funding bills. Let's write an ending that honors those who sacrificed everything for our national security. Congress can do it. I call on my colleagues to join this bipartisan effort for justice. Mr. Speaker, as we begin Women's History Month, we must remember something historic that has happened to women and to women's freedoms. For 50 years, women enjoyed limited, but it was certain reproductive freedoms. A Trump-packed Supreme Court overturned that history, overturned Roe v. Wade, and all of a sudden, history, a sad history, was made when the first time in history, women lost an essential right. We are going back to a very sad time when women cannot make decisions about how and when and if to have a family without governmental interference. We are going back to a sad time in history when women who were suffering complications from pregnancy, who were suffering miscarriages, cannot get health care, but instead get handcuffs. We are suffering a sad time in history when IVF is now prohibited in places like Alabama. And let us remind everybody, almost 200 Republicans in this very chamber have voted for, have co-sponsored legislation which mirrors the Alabama law, which prohibits IVF. As we begin Women's History Month, let's not turn back the clock on women's progress. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize my friend Leger Fernandez from New Mexico.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member, and thank you, witnesses, for being here today. So once again, we are here, and the Education Committee is looking backwards, not forwards. They're stoking the fear and divisiveness of the culture wars. Thankfully, we just saw the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals with 2 Trump appointees strike down Ron DeSantis' so-called Stop Woke Act. These attacks against diversity are looking back to a time when white males dominated our institutions. We simply can't go back. We need our institutions to reflect the strength of our country. Diversity is our strength and can and should be celebrated. To those who think our nation has moved beyond to a colorblind society, I'm going to quote Kevin McCarthy, Speaker Kevin McCarthy at the time, who said, no, not at the time, but who said in regard to the 2019 State of the Union, I look over at the Democrats and they stand up. They look like America. We stand up, we look like the most restrictive country club in America, close quote. Check out the State of the Union tonight and see if things have changed. My own story as the first Latina to represent my district is indeed a DEI story. As a Latina from rural New Mexico at a small school that didn't have AP classes or normally sends students to the Ivy Leagues, I was recruited to attend Yale by someone who saw my promise and my SAT scores. Besides the few Latinos and Black students similarly recruited to diversify the student body, it was generally wealthy, white, and still mostly male. In my study spot in the library, I received notes telling me that I did not belong there. If I ate lunch with my Latino and Black classmates, my white classmates would complain about the mere fact that we were eating together. The university did not at that time provide the range of DEI programs that so many students benefit from today. I worked hard to create opportunities for my classmates to learn more about my community and broaden their perspectives. I invited Cesar Chavez to speak on campus and repacked the halls. And it was white students who were there with the Latinos. They wanted to know more about what was happening with the farm workers, what was happening in my Latino communities. Research shows that all students perform better when classrooms are more diverse. Mr. Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record the article, Report, STEM Classes with Racial Socioeconomic Representation Boost Student GPA.
No objections.
Dr. Murphy, I really want to thank you for your emphasis on facts and research, not just anecdote, although I told my anecdote. I want to thank you for your emphasis on respect and opportunity and dignity. But could you share with us how DEI initiatives actually strengthen student bodies rather than divide them?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that, again, that feeling that research shows, but everyone's human experience shows as well, where when you are in a place where you feel respected and as good as everybody else, you perform at a higher level. When we're looking at highly selective colleges, the colleges some people now call highly rejective colleges because there's so few students can get into them, a lot of the success that students get from that experience is being around other students, right? Being around students who are not like them, right? And learning about sort of the richer American experience and gaining from those different perspectives. So, in fact, the emphasis on simply inclusion, just that one element there, is a crucial part of how DEI actually drives success, right? Retention and completion onward into a career.
Right, and the idea that we would want our leaders, because if you're going to universities, you're going to be a leader, whether it be in business or here in Congress, wouldn't we want them to be curious about and know more about their diverse communities?
Absolutely, and if you look at private industry, you'll see diversity officers or DEI officers in a huge portion of private industry, right? These are private corporations that are choosing to hire somebody because they're recognizing the value of having somebody essentially there who can make sure that these issues are always at the table, not running the table, but at the table.
Right, and when we all are at the table, we can be more respectful of each other. I think I have 6 seconds left.
I'm sorry.
I will end on that respect and dignity includes all of us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much.
Or did that? I think that's an altogether different legislative proposal that I wouldn't be opposed to, but that's not. We're not telling the federal government how to spend its money here. We're just telling them to either use and encouraging them to use the property or dispose of the excess property.
All right. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions she may have. Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for any questions he may have.
You bring this up. There's no space being used for milk cows, were there, that you found?
The GAO did its study, as far as I understood it, in D.C. proper. So I'm not sure I've seen a lot of Holsteins wandering around the district here, but I don't know of any space that was used for cows here.
If there were space, could that bring the price down if it would let the cows produce milk, rain or shine?
Well, I just don't know about that. I better just leave that one alone. It'd be here in D.C. I'm not sure how versed they are at dealing with milk and cows. Thomas might have to.
But on a serious note, we do need a new FBI building, don't we?
Well,
is that not the most ludicrous, unbelievable money, waste of taxpayers' dollars? All these buildings sitting empty, and it's all over the country, but particularly in Washington, D.C.
Well,
building a new FBI building.
I think that's the point. If the gentleman would just allow me, is that these are headquarters here in Washington, D.C., and if the utilization rate is that low here at the headquarters, just imagine what it is. They didn't survey all across the country. Right here in D.C., 17 of 24 buildings with that lower utilization rate, and some as low as 9% utilization.
Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing this up,
Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Chair. And, I don't have a big issue with better understanding how our federal real estate's been used and what is the appropriate measure to take to do it. I just wonder why we're doing this now, right, when we have so little precious time. And it strikes me that, the anger that we've seen Republicans have over so much of what's related to the pandemic is kind of like they're still mad about how bad President Trump botched the whole response to the pandemic. 4 years ago, the country was gripped by a pandemic that caused inflation because of supply chain issues, together with Putin, who, with his war, has caused tremendous inflation in gas prices. That pandemic killed over 1 million beautiful American souls. 4 years ago, Trump told us that April winds would blow it away. He told us to drink disinfectants. He failed the most basic presidential duty that he owes to the American people, as we heard last Thursday. He failed the duty to care. Thankfully, President Biden won the election, and with congressional Democrats, we successfully pulled America out of that health crisis. We averted the financial catastrophe the pandemic threatened. We saved lives and livelihoods. Rather than using this horrible tragedy that the pandemic represented to come together as a nation to save lives, Republicans have spent the last 4 years complaining about everything from the vaccine to how the pandemic accelerated the way people work. And I think looking at the way we now occupy the federal buildings is one of the cases. I do have some concerns regarding the fact that every building is different, every community is different. Some of these federal buildings are in places like DC where there might be a lot of commercial places. Others are in rural areas where there just aren't options. And then some of these buildings are beautiful historic buildings that require cultural preservation concerns. So, I do take under advisement the issues that are in the Statement of Administration Policy.
Lady from New Mexico.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for testifying. Representative Duncan, if the bipartisan security supplemental appropriation bill were brought to the floor, of which we are hopeful that it does, would you vote for it?
I haven't seen the bill to read it, tell you whether I'd vote for it or not. We'd definitely look at it.
Yeah, so it's in the Senate. It's, we've all read a lot about it. But one of the reasons...
That's probably why I haven't seen it, since it's in the Senate.
It's because in the Senate. One of the reasons I asked that is I appreciated your comments and concern about our European allies and the need to bring down natural gas prices and to help out our European allies and to help out with, the volatile energy market. And the reality is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine created a volatility in the energy markets that led to a 42% increase in energy costs. It led to gasoline costing $1.48 more than it did before the war. And the fact that, so I think that when we have those in the House who are pushing back against providing support to Ukraine, it's just wrong, because that Russia invasion and what Putin has done has not been good for anybody with regards to energy prices. And it's that volatility in the energy prices that I think, there's lots of different reasons why we should support our allies in our democracies against Putin, a dictator, authoritarian, lots of awful things. But that's one of them, and it just struck me when you were sort of expressing your support for helping our European allies. But I wanted to also touch on this concept that we need to do this now because of oil and gas. Oil and gas production is at its highest levels, and it could be at its highest levels and also having some of the highest levels of profit. And I'm from New Mexico, so when we have high oil and gas production, it's actually good for us, right? But at the same time, in New Mexico, we are very concerned about how do we improve the health and safety of especially the workers, because when there's a lot of methane emissions, the workers are the ones who are breathing that. But it's also a resource that we are losing if it is not being captured. And so we actually adopted some of the more forward-looking methane regulations in the United States. And you know what happened with oil and gas productions when we increased methane regulations? Are you aware of what happened in New Mexico?
I'm not. Tell me.
Yeah. Guess what? Oil and gas production went up, which shows that regulating for the climate and regulating for oil and gas does not necessarily reduce production. And are you supportive of capturing methane emissions?
I am, and I think the industry's done a phenomenal job in addressing methane. They're not flaring as much. They're actually capturing much and using it.
And I thank you for that, because that's exactly what the industry itself says, is that they believe that reduction of methane emissions is essential, and they actually welcome regulations to do that. And I'm very, concerned because of the fact that we have so much methane emissions going on. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record, seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the article U.S. oil and gas system emissions from nearly 1 million aerial site measurements.
Without objection.
And the shorter article, that's a nice long study done by Stanford, the shorter article describing it, which is U.S. energy industry methane emissions are triple what government thinks.
Without objection.
And I'm thankful, Mr. Stauber, are you in favor of capturing methane emissions from productions?
I'll respond the same way as Representative Duncan, I agree.
I'm sorry, what?
I'll respond the same way as Representative Duncan, I agree. He said it very well.
Okay. And I think that's really great. And what I would suggest that we do is actually, I have an amendment that I am seeking to actually encourage and help pursue that methane reduction, because it shows, this study shows that there are actually not that many sites that are responsible for about half of methane emissions, and that we could really bring down global warming by doing some of this low-hanging fruit. And so I would hope that you would also be supportive of amendments which encourage that kind of methane reduction. I see it's such a powerful argument that I'm even losing my my label, but because I was out, I go out in my district. I go out, and when I meet with my producers, they are in favor of methane reduction tools, and so that's why I'm looking for support for that kind of sensible regulation that brings down greenhouse gases, that builds on the Inflation Reduction Act, because we know it's not always sensible. Representative Dingell, we had some comments earlier about bonding, and that we really don't have much of a problem with regards to oil and gas producers who sometimes walk away from their obligations. I actually carried a bill to address the orphan wells, and we ended up with about $4 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act to address the fact that way too many producers had walked away from their obligations to clean up their mess. And so the taxpayer was left holding the bag. Can you respond to some of the comments with regards to the problems around bonding and their adequacy?
I would be happy to. We have heard the Republicans say that bonding reform isn't needed to make sure the oil and gas industry cleans up its own mess, saying that BLM has identified only 37 orphan wells, but that's not the complete picture. An unplugged well can sit idled or even abandoned for many, many years before a federal agency seeks to enforce reclamation requirements and finally declare it officially orphaned. That process eats up valuable staff time and resources, but in that time, these unplugged wells can leak oil and gas, creating environmental and public health hazards, regardless of whether they've been officially deemed an orphaned or not. And we're talking huge numbers. In 2019, nonpartisan GAO identified 2,294 unplugged wells that have not produced in over 10 years. The oil and gas industry should pay to plug and remediate those wells, not the American people.
Thank you for pointing it out. In New Mexico alone, we've done a new mapping, and we've showed that there are 2,391 currently documented orphan wells in our state alone. And in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, and in other places, this is a big problem. And so we cannot hide the fact that there are those who want to be responsible. Like when I met with Chevron, they were like, we want to do right, we want to do right. But there are so many others who walk away from their obligations. So thank you for pointing that out. The last little thing that I'm concerned about, and I'll let you, Mr. Representative Tonko, address the fact that these funds that want to be slashed, who are the people who most benefit from the funds that would get cut?
That would get cut. Certainly the rural communities and in lower income communities, neighborhoods of color oftentimes, who are impacted by these emissions. I think it's important for us to recognize that we can do a lot to improve their quality of life. Their public health is responded to with a measure like that Inflation Reduction Act. You know, there's also talk, if I can address an earlier statement about technologies and reaching to other countries to respond to our needs. There are provisions within the Inflation Reduction Act that require that Build America, Buy America provisions are applicable across the board to these projects. So, you know, for many reasons, I think the efforts here are counterproductive to, you know, addressing the industry itself, because to your point, there are benefits that come with them. This is waste for them also, but also comes to benefits for our consumers and those in special certain territories and geographies, and also the planet benefits.
You know, one of the wonderful things about all of the things that we were talking about there, including the Inflation Reduction Act, is they actually create good paying jobs, right? When we build more pipeline to capture the methane that can power big rigs and that can, you know, create electricity for our companies, we're actually creating jobs for people who are working in the oil patch, who have those skills that we can actually have those good paying jobs. When we plug those orphan wells, we are creating jobs. We have a lot of new rigs now that actually are plugging rigs, and those are good paying jobs. And so I think that we need to recognize that this is like a win-win, right? It's a win for the environment, it's a win for the economy, it's a win for the workers who do this work. And I know, Representative Dingell, you know that many of these are also union workers. And so we are talking about stuff that is good for America and for American workers. Is that correct?
That's correct. We've created more than 200,000 jobs just on EVs and batteries. So, and we're creating more and more. We want to bring those jobs home. I am not going to let China beat us at anything. I want us to stay at the forefront of innovation and technology. You know, I'm not old, but I'm seasoned. I remember the 70s when we lost to Japan for a decade because we weren't ready for the small car market. We can't cede our leadership again. And these policies that we are pushing forward are protecting jobs, bringing jobs home. We want to build them here. We want to lead the global market.
Right, and because we can do something better here, we should do it here, we should build it here, and we should clean it up here with our own workers. And thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Ms. Leger Fernandez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. The anti-Semitism experienced by Jewish students at Columbia University and universities across the country is unacceptable. I've met with several Jewish students from, not several, but lots of Jewish students from across the country who've endured a wave of slurs and threats, and my heart breaks each time I hear those stories, which I think it breaks for everybody on this committee and on the panel. But anti-Semitism is a centuries-old form of hatred rooted in white supremacy. It's also a form of hatred that has sadly been stoked and given a platform by some in the Republican Party. Madam Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record the article from Politico titled, open quote, Donald Trump dined with white nationalist Holocaust denier Nick Fuentes.
Without objection.
In case we don't remember President Trump's remarks after the anti-Semitic white nationalist rally in Charlottesville in 2017, Madam Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record the article from The Atlantic titled, open quote, Trump defends white nationalist protesters. Some very fine people on both sides, close quote.
Without objection.
This committee has held 3 hearings on anti-Semitism on college campuses, but not one of these hearings has considered a bill to actually address the scourge of anti-Semitism. In fact, last fall, House Republicans proposed a 25% budget cut to the office that's actually investigating and can take action against universities if there is anti-Semitism on campuses that is actionable. The committee could be more productive on this issue and hold a hearing on Congresswoman Manning's bipartisan, bicameral bill, H.R. 7921, the Countering Anti-Semitism Act. The bill would designate a senior official at the Department of Education to counter anti-Semitism on college campuses, among other solutions, provide data, get us the information we need so we can actually take action, because we must do more than complain. We need to take action. We need to actually have solutions. Dr. Scheiser, as co-chair of Columbia's Task Force on Anti-Semitism, would you support the kind of legislation that gives us more data and a mechanism to fight anti-Semitism?
Data is critical because we need to know more about the issues that we're addressing. And I've seen Congresswoman Manning's bill, and I think it is very well crafted.
Thank you. It has lots of provisions that actually would assist with the issues that we've heard about today. I'd also point out that anti-Semitism isn't the only form of hatred rising in our schools. It's not the only form of hatred that is impacting our children's or students' ability to learn. Islamophobia and hate crimes against LGBTQ students have also recently spiked. They've led to deaths by suicide, harassment, but this committee has not held a single hearing on these issues. The rise in hatred across the United States is not good for learning. It's bad for democracy. We need to find a way to heal and have our students and have our entire nation understand that we are indeed one nation under God, different forms of gods that we worship. But that when we can come to understand each other as related and as connected and respect each other, and not tear each other down, that is when we truly start learning to prosper and thrive. And I look forward to working on the kinds of solutions that get us to this point. I hope this committee can be part of the solutions. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back. Many of our witnesses, and I want to thank each of you for coming here. I also want to thank each of you for bringing to the committee and bringing to the American people, as well as the House membership, the unity of vision that you have presented to us today. The concept that we are in a moment where we must act, and we must act decisively, and it should be bipartisan. Thank you very much, Chairman Cole and McCall, for that. Thank you very much, ranking members. Democrats have been asking that we be allowed to vote, that we allow the membership of the United States House of Representatives to vote, to support Ukraine, to support our allies, to recognize, as you said it so clearly, Chairman McCall, and that we all know that China, Iran, Russia, are not our friends. They are our enemies. And when they attack our friends, we must stand with our allies. And that when we have that vote, I'm certain it's going to be incredibly bipartisan, because there are so many Republicans who also want to stand for democracy, who also want to push back the attacks, that Xi Jinping and the Ayatollahs and Putin. When they attack Ukraine, they also have attacked us in the future and intend to do in the past. I mean, Chairman McCall, would you agree that Russia has malevolent intent to America and will continue to seek to undermine us in ways from cyber attacks to what they're doing in Ukraine and other ways?
Well, I grew up in the Cold War, and my wife tracked
Russian Soviet submarines in the Navy, naval intelligence, and those submarines are back. They are an adversary. The idea that they're not connected to China, I mean, they were holding hands at the Beijing Olympics, talking about the unholy alliance and how he's going to invade Ukraine. And any expert you talk to, every military, General Jack Keane to Mike Pompeo, will tell you there's a national security interest here, because if Ukraine falls, then Moldova is going to fall, then Georgia, then the Baltics are at stake. And you're looking at parallels to 1939 all over again. And then eventually they're going to hit a chord with the NATO Article 5, and we're going to have to send our men and women over there. And the reason I want this, they're fighting for us is what they tell me. And I want to give them everything they need to at least push the Russians back so we don't have to send our men and women over there. It's called deterrence. If we fail on that and surrender in Ukraine like we did in Afghanistan, does that make the United States, does that make it more powerful or weaker? It makes us weaker, as we're not projecting strength, and we lose the trust and confidence of our allies. I think that's a big mistake, and it would have a long-term generational impact. I don't want our men and women over there.
Which
and
is
if we do nothing, that's going to happen.
Well, thank you very much. And Chairman, that's why I'm so perplexed at the fact that there are Republicans who oppose supporting Ukraine. Because the Republican history has been condemning Russia. I mean, that changed somewhat. I mean, we had...
Well, I would say, what would Ronald Reagan do?
What would Ronald Reagan do?
He stood up to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
He brought down the Soviet Union. He was not an isolationist. He believed that we were the leader of the free West. He didn't shrink from that responsibility. I can't speak for my other colleagues. I can just speak for what I believe as a Republican that grew up and had the honor to vote for Reagan my first election. So, I'm with you on the border. God, I fought to, we all did. And we passed H.R. 2. And you know what? There will be an election. And we can get back to what works. But
we can't
abandon our allies. We abandoned our allies at this critical point. Then where are we then?
And I think at this point, and the sort of understanding of the evil of Russia, I think was Republican and Democrat, basically until we hit President Trump. But ranking member, you were going to
let me
add to that.
Just add a couple of things, which is important. First, talk about the Ukrainian people. I led the last CODEL to Ukraine before the Russian invasion. And what we did, we talked to the Ukrainian people. We didn't just go to the political class. We went and we talked to taxi drivers, bus drivers. We went to restaurants. And we talked to the people. And what we were saying to them was that this threat of Russia attacking was about to happen. We told them that our intelligence said that they would invade. And I will tell you not just about every Ukrainian person that I spoke to said all you have to do is give us weapons. You don't have to fight America. Give us what we need, and we will fight. They still had in their minds what took place with Crimea. Many had said they had been part of the Soviet Union. They would never wear those green uniforms again. They would fight. They said, don't worry about us fighting. We would win. All we're going to do is ask America is to give us what we need to fight with. And we will beat back Vladimir Putin and the Russians. And that's where we are right now. And guess what? President Joe Biden, many thought, as I'm sure Putin did, that we would be divided from our allies. Many thought that our allies would not work with us. but it was the skill and the diplomacy utilized by Joe Biden, which what history will record. Guess what? NATO is now stronger than ever. Putin didn't count on it. Some of my colleagues here didn't think that it could happen. But NATO, now, who would have thought that Finland and Sweden, long countries that would be neutral, had decided to join NATO in this struggle? Joe Biden helped put that together. Joe Biden, listen, it wasn't America alone, because we realized we had to work with all of our allies. We just had the Prime Minister of Japan speak to Congress. Guess what Joe Biden has done in the Indo-Pacific? Japan and South Korea for a long time were just not talking to one another. There was a historic meeting between Japan and South Korea, put together by Joe Biden, bringing the Indo-Pacific together, working and creating the Quad, India, Australia. Look at what we're doing with AUKUS, bringing our allies together. It's not America out there by itself. It's America, what we said, and our allies. The skill that Joe Biden has of diplomacy, bringing us together, working together to defeat, yes, as my colleague said, we must defeat and beat Russia. We must make sure that China, we must make sure that we hold North Korea at bay. Those are the things that we need to do. And what Joe Biden is doing is putting together those coalitions. How do you combat China? Having a unified Indo-Pacific. And that's what's taking place there. How do you combat Putin? Have a unified Europe. How do you combat Iran? Being unified. That's the skill that Joe Biden has made. That's the skill and the people that Joe Biden has put back to make sure that we are on our road to work together. And now we need to give Ukrainians what they need so that they can defeat Vladimir Putin.
Mr. Chairman, I get to still call you Mr. Chairman.
Can I make a slight response to that? I wish you would. And look, I don't want this to be a campaign ad for Joe Biden, and this is very serious. And I'll say this very objectively, as I see it, as a fairly rational Republican, I think, and that is, and my friend and I agree on a lot. And look, a lot of what he said, has happened. But I have pleaded with this White House on Ukraine to put the weapons in they need to win for 2 years. And it's been a slow walk. At first it was javelins and stingers and HIMARS and, then F-16s and then ATACMS. The very long-range artillery that could take out the bridge between Russia, Crimea. I'm not a general, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out you cut the supply line, That's written in this bill, by the way. The Colin Powell doctrine, either get in, all in, or get the hell out, right? You don't do it halfway. And I've had a criticism of that. Now, I also have another theory, that with the collapse of Afghanistan, and the way it was done was so humiliating that it sent waves of weakness around the world to our adversaries, and it emboldened them and empowered them such that Putin, for the first time, thought, this is my time. This is my time. It's weak. This president looks weak to me. That's when we see the Russian Federation, literally within months, coming down to invade Ukraine, the alliance with Xi, and the Ayatollah rearing his ugly head. You have to ask the question, and I'm not trying to be partisan here, why is this all happening? Why is the world on fire? What caused this?
So it's
I go back to the old doctrine of Chamberlain and Churchill. Chamberlain, peace in our time. Hitler says, not worth the peace papers written. Deterrence is key. If we don't provide deterrence, which this bill does, we're going to invite more aggression, more conflict, more war. That's what weakness does. You project strength, you get peace. And I think this bill, will provide the deterrence.
What strength did was bringing people together. Because had we not then NATO would not have been together. What strength meant, we couldn't do all the things we wanted that Mr. McCall, that's doing it alone. But working with and talking and taking into consideration what our allies were saying. Some of our allies wasn't ready to go there. They would not have been with us. But it's the Biden administration said, well, let's talk. I'm telling you this is going to happen. Stick with me. Let's stick together and we can win this thing. Many thought that Germany would not be there because of their deal dealing with Gulfstream. They said, oh, they would never give up being independent of Russia. Forget them. Let's move without them. Not Joe Biden. Joe Biden said we can bring them together. We can work together. And the only reason I brought this up is because the way the chairman started out, like not talking about making this a pro-Biden, but not this is trying to make this an anti-Biden. Biden he deserves credit. And history will give him the credit he deserves for bringing our allies together.
So I think what's interesting is that I was trying to get to the fact that we have unanimity of vision among the four of you that we need to get this done, right? We clearly do not agree on how we got to this situation, right? Because I look at things, and I have here the Foreign Policy Review, which says history will judge the Trump presidency to have been a consequential one, but more for its destructive effect, where it goes through and we look at what is the history of Trump, and it was destroying our allegiances. It was, cozying up to Putin. Now, I kind of don't want to talk about what led. It's like, what is the moment we are facing now? And the moment we are facing now is one where America is calling on us to act. It's calling on us to be able to vote. And depending on where you stand, if you think your constituents don't want you spending more money on Ukraine or on humanitarian efforts, they'll vote that way. But allow us to vote. And I think that that's where we are at. And I know the appropriators want to speak. And so, Mr. Chair and then Ranking Member.
Just quickly, because I agree with my friend. We are united on the issue in front of us today. But I also agree with my friend from Texas. There's context. My friend from New Mexico said, we just want to vote. Honestly, that's all we want from the United States Senate on H.R. 2, and it's been over there for over a year. That's all we want on TikTok legislation that we all agreed with pretty much over here, and it hasn't come to a vote. That's all we agreed to on a tax bill, for God's sake, that came out of Ways and Means overwhelming. So I understand the frustration of my friends that say all we want to do is get a vote on something we think is important. The United States Senate has not given us things on bipartisan things that we think are important here. Not just H.R. 2, but on TikTok, on tax stuff. So I'm glad we're rising above the United States Senate, but we are rising above the United States Senate. We are not trying to hold this hostage. We don't think it's an appropriate thing to do. The United States Senate has held hostage things on the southern border that would make an enormous difference with fentanyl pouring in, child trafficking happening, crime coming in. So while we agree on this issue, we don't agree on context. And quite frankly, again, I'm pleased the president is doing this in terms of Ukraine. Some of my colleagues are not. I respect that. But I will also tell you the Obama-Biden administration did zero when Putin went to take Crimea in 2014. Zero. They never sent lethal aid. They got meals to eat and blankets. The first guy to actually send lethal aid to Ukraine was actually Donald Trump. And we knew for months before this invasion happened that it was coming. We knew for months. Did we send anything early to show them we were serious? Did we deter then? No, we did not. So I also agree with my friend from Texas. Ukraine was a pretty bad signal. If I was sitting in Moscow and I saw the United States liquidate a 20-year commitment and turn 38 million people back over to the very people that hosted Osama bin Laden, I think, well, they damn sure ain't going to fight for Ukraine. So when the historians look at this, they won't start looking at it this vote. They'll go back to 2014, and it'll be a very nuanced picture along the way. Having said all that, to be fair, it's water under the bridge. I mean, I love history, but I know when the moment is now on this stuff. We do agree because we see it. And I'll leave it to the historians to pin blame and whatever. And again, with all due respect to people on my side of the aisle, that when I find something, to quote my good friend, the ranking member, that I can agree on, as opposed to things where we disagree, I'm going to act. I'm not going to try to leverage one against the other. I'm not going to say where we agree, I'm not going to do something with you because over here we disagree and you won't do something. I'm just not going to do that. I don't think it works. I think it leads to gridlock. But again, there's a lot of context here. And I think, it's fair, as my friend from Texas, Chairman, to talk about some of that too, because, and to understand where some of the frustration is with people I don't agree with on this issue, but why they're upset that things they think are important can't be voted on in the United States Senate. We're not asking for a predetermined outcome. We're just asking for a vote. And it's like here, we're not asking for a predetermined outcome. I think one of the strengths of the package in front of us is it's going to let every single member do what they want to do. If you are against aid to Israel and for aid to Ukraine, as some of my friends on the Democratic side are, you're going to have that ability to do this. If, as you're against Ukrainian aid but for Israel, the Speaker is not trying to jam you. He's trying to give every member in the body a choice to pick what they think is important. I think that's a good thing. And frankly, I wish we saw more of it in the United States Senate. Because this Speaker is actually trying to provide this House with the ability to work its will. And I think that's what we have the opportunity to do.
Well,
and thank goodness we all agree on this particular item. You might not agree with what I said, but on this item, I want to end on a positive note. I couldn't be prouder of my friend, the ranking member on appropriations. I couldn't be prouder of my friend, the ranking member on foreign affairs. And I'm happy to act with the President of the United States, with whom I disagree on many occasions, but I don't on this one. And I'm not going to let the areas that I disagree with him on stop me from supporting him in a measure where I do agree, let alone with my colleagues who I've had the privilege of working with many times, who are great legislators. But on this one we agree, and so happy to be here and support it. Yield back. I'm sorry.
So, right. The immigration debate, I think, is something that we began last night. It was killed by members of the Republican members of this committee. Did not move forward. Has gone over to the Senate, has not moved forward. There was a bipartisan bill that Trump killed in the Senate. But a ranking member, DeLauro.
In many respects, we continue to sit here and to deal with revisionist history here. Lest we forget, it was the Trump administration that violated the Impoundment Control Act, illegally withholding security assistance from Ukraine. Let's not forget that when we think about what emboldened Putin, let us not forget the words of the former president, which everyone has invoked here today in some way or another, that Putin is his dearest friend. He knows him well. And don't you think Putin is waiting very, very carefully to see another Trump administration? They are joined at the hip. So let's not sugarcoat what is going on here in terms of trying to indict the Biden administration. I want to walk away from this whole debate about administrations, because it is not the moment at hand. One sentence about border security. I sat in the White House, not in a classified meeting, where Republican colleagues said that we won't have Ukraine without bipartisan border security. And then you know what? We accomplished bipartisan border security. It wasn't, and it was, you can shake your head all you want, but Democrats and Republicans voted for border security. And you know what? It was Donald Trump who said, don't give Biden a win. You think about that. Put that aside. This moment is now. The United States Senate, you can have all the views you want about the United States Senate, but hold them for this debate. It is now. It is about the United States House of Representatives. We have the opportunity to do what we do here, and that is to govern. And what are we doing in governing? Is to be a world leader. And for months and months, we have been diddling around where people are dying in Ukraine. Don't talk about what weapons we want to give them. We're not giving them what they need now, and it has been months in the coming. And we ought to today, immediately, we should have picked up that Senate bill, brought it to the floor, and voted on it immediately, and we would be out of here today in doing it. Let us not rewrite what is happening. The moment is ours. And if the House of Representatives abdicates its responsibility, yes, the history will write the story. And that it is on us. When we had that moment, we said no. I, for one, will not say no. I will provide Ukraine with the weapons that it needs to go forward. I would provide Israel what it needs to defend against Iran. I am overwhelmingly in support of our being able to deliver humanitarian assistance at a volume that will meet that need, because we're standing by. We're standing by and watch Ukrainians die. We're standing by and watch Palestinians starve to death, Sudanese starve to death, Haitians, etc. If that's the way we want to be remembered in history, it's certainly not the way I want to be remembered. So let's vote on what we need to be doing here today, casting our vote in favor of the national security package.
Thank you so much. And I think it is casting a vote against starvation. It is casting a vote against deprivation. It is casting a vote for democracy is what we are looking for when we are able to look at this package and vote on it. And I will end with quoting a Democrat president. Democracy is never a final achievement. It is a call to an untiring effort. John F. Kennedy. And we must continue that untiring effort for values that honor civilian lives and for values that honor democracy. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Meeks, it sounded like there was some new sanctions and authority in here that you might be uncomfortable with. Are you comfortable with all the new sanction authority that's granted in this, in the bills that are covered by
Reserves.
Hey, Tom.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from New Mexico, a valued member of the Rules Committee, Ms. Leger Fernandez.
The gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today, after months of delay that cost the loss of the Ukrainian military advantage, that cost children's lives and access to food and aid, that allowed China to threaten the Indo-Pacific, Congress will finally vote. Congress is finally going to vote to fund the fight against the tyranny of Russia, Iran, and China, the fight for democracy and peace. Why did it take us this long? Yesterday, in Rules, the Republican chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee noted that every Republican president since the Soviet Union era has stood on the right side of history and stood up to Russia. Presidents from Eisenhower to Reagan to Bush, Sr. and Jr., they all knew that Russia's desire to reassert its empire by bombing and invading its neighbor also harms America and American interests. Every Republican president, that is, until Donald Trump. In contrast to every president before him, Trump praised Putin, tried to do business in Russia, allowed Putin to gain the upper hand, and eventually denied Ukraine military aid Congress had approved unless Ukraine gave him dirt on Biden. Donald Trump became the Pied Piper for Putin. Some of Trump's most ardent followers in this House became Putin-protecting Republicans and denied the members of Congress this vote. Until now. Now is the moment. History has its eyes on this chamber as Democrats and Republicans stand up and stand together for what we love, democracy. Democracy is the very reason we get to sit here together today and debate in the People's House. Democracy is the best answer to tyranny, aggression, and depravity. It is our shared bipartisan love for democracy that best unites us with our allies around the world, allies that are once again united in our fight against Iran, China, and Russia, thanks to the leadership of President Biden, who repaired the damage Trump inflicted on our international relationships. I hope that shared love of a world where democracy is defended will also unite us in this chamber. I remind my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, that bipartisanship is a good thing. It's how America expects us to govern, and it is how we move one step closer to defeating the cruel regimes that seek to take the world backward. I yield back.
Yields back.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, gentlelady. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for questions.
You know, the anti-Semitism experienced by Jewish students on college campuses is very worrisome. Mr. Fry, I appreciate the fact that you've been watching the TV coverage, but I've actually talked to college students, to Jewish students, and I've heard firsthand some of the anti-Semitism, and it breaks my heart. I have sat through numerous hearings in the Education Committee where all we do is talk about this. We don't do anything about it. And that's the problem, is that the way to do something about this problem is to fund the agency that actually would investigate and hold colleges accountable. And every time we ask to do something like that, we don't get it. And in fact, the Republicans proposed cutting the agency, as we've talked about today. And you know, that's it. We can't just complain. We actually have to fund the agencies that would do the work. Now, with regards to the definition itself, I think there are problems. And Ranking Member Nadler, I mean, I think one of the reasons why it's opposed codifying it is because things do change. And there is also a concern about criticism of Israel becoming equated with anti-Semitism, and isn't that one of the reasons why many Jewish organizations are worried?
Yes, that's exactly right. And let me give you a list of Jewish organizations who are opposing H.R. 6090. J Street, the Nexus Project, Jewish Council for Public Affairs, TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, Bend the Arc, Jewish Action, and the New Israel Fund. In addition to that, other organizations that are that have opposed codifying IRA in the past are Americans for Peace Now, Aleph, Alliance for Jewish Renewal, New Israel Fund, Partners for Progressive Israel, and Reconstructionist Judaism. So all these Jewish organizations oppose this bill or oppose codifying IRA, which is what this bill does.
Right. And I think that's really important that we're actually hearing, and it's not universal, it's not unanimous, but we're hearing from Jewish organizations. They do not want this codified because they recognize they themselves might want to be able to criticize Israel, because not all believe that Netanyahu has done a remarkable job. In fact, many criticize what Netanyahu has done. He has not done a remarkable job in many eyes. And I think that it's also really important to remember that we need to fund the Office of Civil Rights, because anti-Semitism is not new. Anti-Semitism is a centuries-old problem, and it's rooted in white supremacy. And white supremacy takes aim at many different peoples. And white supremacy, and the people who espouse white supremacy, are given a platform by some in the Republican Party. Mr. Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record the article from Politico titled "Donald Trump Dined with White Nationalist Holocaust Denier Rick Fuentes."
Without objection, so ordered.
And, Ranking Member, you also pointed out the fact that Trump was not critical of the very anti-Semitic remarks in Charlottesville. Mr. Chair, I'd like unanimous consent to enter into the record the article from the Atlantic titled "Trump Defends White Nationalist Protesters," open quote, "some very fine people on both sides," close quote.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Fry, would you condemn the white nationalist who protested in Charlottesville?
I think that's unequivocal, yes.
We should all condemn that. And I think that's the problem, is that we do not have widespread condemnation of white nationalists from the Republican Party at this point in time. As I said before, I believe that we need to fund the agency. I believe that we need to address anti-Semitism. I spoke in favor of Kathy Manning's bill in the department, in our committee hearing, because that's where we start, with a comprehensive effort and not with something that has these problematic provisions in it. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The woman from New Mexico reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I reserve. I am prepared to close.
The gentlewoman reserves.
I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman from New Mexico is recognized.
I'm prepared to close. Madam Speaker, the bills my Republican colleagues have proposed today threaten to overturn regulations put in place to make sure that we are responsible in our use of natural resources. The Biden administration has worked to reverse so many of the Trump-era policies that just helped the rich get richer. For too long, what we have seen in America is the rich keep getting richer, and it appears that Republicans, certain Republicans, but most definitely former President Trump, favored the richest corporations. In turn, I ask my colleagues to think about what is our role here in Congress. I want to remind my colleagues of these powerful words from the Conference of Bishops. I quote, "We show our respect for the Creator by our stewardship of creation. Care for the earth is not just an Earth Day slogan, it is a requirement of our faith. We are called to protect people and the planet, living our faith in relationship with all of God's creation. It is possible to protect the planet and still be a leader in energy. In the last 3 years, the Biden administration has invested over $18 billion towards federal, state, local, and tribal land conservation efforts in all 50 states. Contrary to what my colleagues claim, the U.S. has had a record number of oil and gas production under the Biden administration. We produced an average of 12.9 million barrels of crude oil, millions more than coming out of Russia and Saudi Arabia. But regulations are important. They prevent catastrophic environmental disasters like the 137 oil spills that occurred during the second year of the Trump administration. And remember, there will be no more elk to hunt, no more breathtaking lakes reflecting the sunlight to hike on, and no more oil or minerals to drill if we do not listen to the experts about protecting our lands and waters. Wildlife protections and mining regulations are in place to make sure future generations of Americans can enjoy the same beautiful landscapes and profit off of Americans' resources. And finally, I need to remind everybody, we all condemned the October 7th. We all have condemned Hamas. It is a terrorist organization. But we have taken up these resolutions over and over again. And once again, our Republican colleague has spoken the truth when he has said that these are sticky resolutions simply intended to divide the Democrats. Let's not work on division. Let's come together in love and a belief in each of our individual strengths to push back against the hatred that we see, and to do it in a manner that is not partisan, but that uplifts our morality, that uplifts our empathy for all, that addresses all the forms of hatred that we see. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman would like to remind members on both sides not to address the speaker and not to address each other.
I reserve.
Oh, the gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves, and the gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I just want to make the record clear. Democrats and President Biden have repeatedly and constantly, and not just since October 7th, condemned anti-Semitism and taken actual actions to actually address it. And that is the problem with what we are hearing. As their own Rules Committee member has said it, these are about sticky bills. They are not about getting solutions. But we must remember that most of the bills on the rule today are actually talking about our natural resources and how Republicans want to turn the clock back on the progress that Americans have been demanding for decades to protect our natural beauty, but also to protect our natural resources for Americans. I want to talk a little bit about mining reform. 1872 mining law, that says it all. That law is way too old and needs fixing. But how do we make sure we go about fixing it? The Republicans' proposal is just give more of it away. Make it easier for foreign corporations, for big greedy corporations to take that land, to take those natural resources. What do Democrats propose? We propose responsible mining reform that allows for critical minerals to be extracted without destroying our environment. My good friend and ranking member, former chair of the House Natural Resources, introduced the Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act, the Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act, of which I'm a co-sponsor. That kind of bill would require annual rental payments for claimed public land, treating mine operators the same way we treat oil and gas or any other ones. Let's make them pay for our resources. They belong to us. Imagine if that like $300 billion of profits that's going to those foreign corporations went to Americans instead. We'd set a royalty rate of not less than 5%, not greater than 8% based on gross income. We would make sure that there would be a reclamation fund. So when the mining companies go in there and do their mess, that there would be a way for us to clean it up. I can tell you New Mexico is littered, Colorado, all the Intermountain West, with these abandoned mines that leach acid into our rivers and streams and make it so that we cannot hike and camp on those lands. I have picked up those rocks that when they are exposed to air and water, create sulfuric acid, and they leave piles of them. Those are the things that we must be doing. We must be giving the Secretary of the Interior the right to protect our public lands, to protect the waters of Minnesota, right? To protect the waters of this great country. So with that, I reserve.
Madam Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentlewoman from New Mexico is recognized.
Madam Speaker, the natural resources bills that we are dealing with here today, as I pointed out, are a great gift to big mining corporations, or overturn decades of work by local organizations, by the public in these areas who want to see their lands protected. And what's interesting is Republicans are putting forward these bills even though the American public and their own constituents are not interested in seeing what they're doing. So while Republicans are helping out the big mining corporation friends, their constituents want the opposite. I'd like to submit into the record the article, I ask unanimous consent to submit into the record the article analysis. Public comments overwhelmingly support BLM public lands rule.
Without objection.
That analysis found that the Biden administration's public lands rule received 92% supportive public comments. 92% of the 150,000 Americans who commented on this rule agreed that the BLM is moving in the right direction by protecting our public lands. Many of them were farmers, ranchers, and stewards of the land. In fact, one farmer said to me, I recognize how important it is to allow our land to recover so that we can use it in the future for grazing. I'd also ask unanimous consent to submit into the record the following article, the 2023 Conservation in the West poll from Colorado College.
Without objection.
This survey found that 82% of voters across 8 Western states support the conservation of our public lands and waters. Let's listen to the people on the ground. While Republicans want to mine the beautiful forests of Minnesota, constituents actually want to protect the area from sulfide or copper mining. I request unanimous consent to submit into the record the article, "The Campaign to Save the Boundary Waters 2022 Post-Election Poll."
Without objection.
The poll found over 70% of Minnesotans support proposed legislation to permanently protect the boundary waters from risks associated with the sulfide or copper mining. The boundary waters are one of the most visited national recreational areas in the United States. I look forward to going and looking at those lakes and those rivers and those forests and how they're intertwined and how those canoes glide along their surfaces. Minnesotans know what that beauty looks like, and they want to make sure that the mining that is proposed by the Trump administration, and I might remind people that the Trump administration overturned actions by Obama so they could give 2 leases to a Chilean billionaire. A Chilean billionaire who it so happens, was a landlord of the president's daughter. These kinds of dealings with foreign corporations we must say no to. Why would Minnesotans want to take their precious natural resources and have them leased so a Chilean billionaire can make even more money? We are urging our Republican colleagues to listen to their constituents, to listen to the people who are speaking on these issues, and to vote against these rules and to vote against these bills. With that, I reserve.
The representative from New Mexico, Ms. Leger Fernandez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Acting Secretary Sue. I want to begin with an apology for the disrespectful behavior by some of my colleagues, rather than allowing you the opportunity to provide substantive answers to their questions. You've been interrupted numerous times. I also want to clarify, the Senate has never rejected your nomination. In fact, your nomination as Deputy Secretary was passed, and your nomination as Secretary was passed out of the appropriate committee. The fact that you have stood with workers and workers' families should be something that we all celebrate, because that is indeed in your job description. And we appreciate it. I know that the workers and the workers' families in my district and in my state appreciate it. I want to also thank you for doing a great summary in response to some of the earlier questions about how far our economy has grown, how many jobs we've added in the last 4 years, especially when you answer the question, are we better off today than we were 4 years ago? 4 years ago was dark under former President Trump, right? People were unemployed. They were worried about losing their apartments. As you pointed out, you couldn't buy toilet paper, right? It was scary. It was dark. And because of the investments that were done, we have come out of that. But there is a lot more work to do, especially in rural areas that I represent. We know that education, skills, apprenticeships, those make a big difference in securing better paying jobs. And you need the better paying job if you're going to fight the inflation that has been, let's be honest about it, fueled by greedy corporations who record profits are basically on the backs of consumers. Let's be honest about where inflation comes through. And there's some great Federal Reserve articles about that. But these certification courses that are really important, I think, for apprentices and other ones, they don't always apply in rural areas. In my district, an aspiring welder or commercial driver would have to drive 3 hours round trip to get to some of these federally funded training programs. So I want to see if you can talk about expanding the Department of Labor Force's Workforce Opportunity for Rural Communities initiative so that we can start granting those funds in Western rural communities. on a bipartisan basis, right? Well, the rest is checkerboard, blue, red. We need to get that funding out there. How do you see that? How that would make a difference if we moved it to the West in rural communities?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And yes, the workforce opportunities in rural communities is something that that we wanted to do in order to make sure that we are really achieving equity, that every community is seeing benefits from the investments that are being made. And we are now, I think, on the 5th round of those investments. And being able to expand them will only allow us to further reach individuals, families, communities who have been left out for far too long. It's an important time to do it as well, because part of President Biden's vision is that we invest in every single community. So for example, when we build, make sure that there's reliable, high-speed broadband in every community, the ability of people who live in that community to actually work on those jobs is really, really significant. And so our workforce opportunities in rural communities grant helps to make sure that that can happen. Congresswoman, if I could also just mention, because you were here and the Congresswoman Wilson just left, but you both have youth build grants as well that we just announced in your districts. And that's another way that we supplement the workforce programs to make sure that we're reaching all communities, and that one's obviously, as you know.
I have an appropriations letter where hopefully we'll start seeing some of these programs in my district. I want to quickly turn to something else that both New Mexico and other places like Arkansas and Missouri, the arts and recreation, the creative sector really makes a difference, about $1 trillion to the economy. I want to have the Department of Labor work with us to explore how federal workforce development programs, such as apprenticeships, can better serve non-traditional sectors like the arts, like outdoor recreation. We just passed the Explore Act on the floor of the House, led by Chairman Westerman, my Republican colleague from Arkansas. He talked about what they're doing in terms of that kind of economic growth in these rural areas. Would love to work with you on that and look forward to talking about that more in future, because I have run out of time and I am going to yield back. Thank you so much,
I would love to work with
Acting
you on
Secretary Sue.
The representative from Kansas.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks, gentlemen. Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for questions.
So I'll get to some questions in a minute, but I think it's interesting that we heard Representative Washington. I'll go through and mention a couple of Democrat members who might have said defund the police and talked about that. I think what really matters is we are in Congress, and the question is, what has Congress done with regards to law enforcement? And what Congress has done is that during a Democratic-controlled House, Senate, and President, we increased funding for law enforcement. So where we have control, Democrats have stepped up and said, let's fund law enforcement, let's increase law enforcement. Let's give a couple examples. The Byrne Memorial State and local law enforcement assistance. We have control of that. We went from a $1.9 billion to $2.4 billion. That's what Democrats do when we have a choice. What do Republicans do? Let's look at the COPS program, which is so important in my district. Trump wanted to cut it for fiscal 19, eliminate it. He didn't succeed. So what did he do the next fiscal year? Oh, then let's try to cut it by 50%. He didn't succeed. Republicans over and over again bring bills like this, which say they're for law enforcement, but when it comes down, are you going to fund it? And I can tell you, my rural law enforcement members want police in the patrol cars. They want the equipment they need. They want the FBI to investigate those crimes that occur that they don't have the money for. And so when Republicans cut that funding, they are cutting the funding that helps my rural communities. When Republicans go after the FBI, they are hurting my tribal law enforcement because we rely on the FBI to investigate. So Republicans clearly have a problem with the FBI because they don't like the fact that it is investigating January 6th, whether you call it an insurrection, which is what it was, or a violent attack on the Capitol, which it also was. It's their job to investigate that and to prosecute it. Because they're mad at that, They are cutting the FBI. What do I tell my law enforcement in my rural areas when they can't rely on that FBI? What do I tell them when they can't utilize the cops and the burn grants? Their political vendetta hurts my rural law enforcement. Their political vendetta hurts my tribal law enforcement. And the numbers are what counts. What did Republicans vote for? And the Republican Study Committee, once again, let's go after that law enforcement, federal funding for law enforcement that my local rural communities need. The Republican Study Committee wants to cut it. So Representative Nadler, Ranking Member Nadler.
You know, what you said is completely true, and we know about the Republican attempts to cut the FBI and even to eliminate the FBI because they're angry at the FBI's pursuit of the criminals involved in the insurrection, which I will call an insurrection. And we know about the fact that, as you pointed out, that when Democrats had control of the Congress in 2021, and of the Congress and the presidency in 2021 and 2022, in the 117th Congress, we increased funding for the police. And I just wanted to point out that perhaps as a result of that, crime is down in 2024 nationwide, including in major cities. I also point out that not one single one of the bills that we're talking about here invests in law enforcement or makes any community safer. But the investment in law enforcement that the Democratic Congress and the Democratic President made in the last 2 years has resulted in the 2024 nationwide crime statistics going down.
All right, so they actually do a lot of fear-mongering. They always talk about how horrible it is, but then they don't pony up and fund.
And I'll point out also, Mr. Reschenthaler pointed out a $30 million, I think he said, cut in policing in 1 year in Philadelphia. Even if it's true, maybe they had a better use for that money. Maybe they added $50 million or $80 million more a year later. You can't simply look and say that a given department in a city government was cut by a certain amount of money this year and say, therefore, the people in the city council and the mayor don't like that department. There may be a good reason for it. Maybe there was a deficit in Philadelphia in 2020, whatever the year is. I don't know. But you can't simply cite a statistic and say that the city government decreased funding in one department in 1 year must mean that they don't like that department. That's absurd. There may be a dozen different reasons for it.
But more importantly, I mean, rather than sitting here second-guessing what other cities have done, and I am going to defer to our member from Philadelphia, rather than that, it's like, what are we in control of? What can we do? We are Congress, and our job is to fund federal law enforcement, and where we can, have federal law enforcement help our local law enforcement, like we do right now. Last week, there was a baby abducted, a mother killed in Clovis. Clovis is a very small town. It was the FBI that came in and participated in a collaborative process, and that baby is now found. It's that kind of collaboration that is very important, and when Republicans cut the federal law enforcement funding, my towns hurt. I don't know if you want to touch anything more on law enforcement, because I want to get to immigration.
Yes, I just wanted to point out that in the last Congress, Democrats passed the Protecting America's First Responders Act, the Public Safety Officer Support Act, the COPS Act, Confidentiality Opportunities for Peer Support Act, the COPS Counseling Act, and the Law Enforcement De-Escalation Training Act. By contrast, in this Congress, which is almost over, not one single law enforcement bill has passed. Instead, we have meaningless bills like the ones in front of us that do nothing except empty rhetoric.
So I think that that's key, and I think another thing we're doing here is a weekly installment. I'm going to start calling it the Trump's Border Chaos Strategy. Trump's Border Chaos Strategy. Because that's what they do, is they create chaos, they raise the issue of the border, but anytime it comes to let's actually fix it on a bipartisan basis, this problem needs to be fixed on a bipartisan basis, they kill it. They kill it. And we have, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the January 2024 Politico article, Trump vows to fight border deal. All the way.
Yeah, maybe we need a border czar. Without
My
without
request
objection,
was to
so
enter
ordered.
into the record. Mr. Chair, my request was to enter into the record.
Yeah, I said without objection, so ordered.
And I would also enter into a record Trump or a Senate border deal. It's not going to happen, and I'll fight it all the way, which was a Trump social post, January 17th and February 5th, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you so very much. So, Mr. Biggs, how's fentanyl most likely to come into the United States?
I couldn't hear your question.
How does fentanyl enter into the United States?
It comes mostly from the southern border, crossing the southern border.
It comes through the border crossing.
No, I didn't say border crossing. It crosses the border. You don't know what the pool is, because if any Democrats would have come to Arizona where we had the hearing just the other day, you would have heard testimony say very clearly, we don't know how much fentanyl gets in, we don't know what the total pool is. Where we have our resources, that is 90% of what's caught is where we have the resources. And where is that? The port of entry. Where don't we have resources? Between the port of entry. Why don't we have resources between the port of entry? Because we don't have any agents on the line anymore.
Well, I would point out that one of the reasons we don't have as much agents on the port of entry is because Republicans have also worked in the appropriations bill that we heard in rules, they actually proposed cutting funding. And Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the February 2024 article. Many Americans believe migrants bring fentanyl across the border. That's wrong and dangerous. As well as the Cato Institute report. You know the Cato Institute, you guys, that's that nice Republican.
It's not a Republican, ma'am.
Well, conservative.
It's not a conservative group.
Fentanyl is smuggled
They're
for
an
U.S.
open borders
citizens.
libertarian
I'm
group.
sorry, it's my time. Fentanyl is smuggled for U.S. citizens by U.S. citizens, not asylum seekers, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
I am told that the judiciary Republicans are upset about the Cato Institute. You know, they're doing studies, and I think it's really important that that's what we're dealing with here, is we're not addressing the issues as they need to be addressed. We're not putting in more resources into the technology, and we're not doing what Americans want us to do, which is to solve this problem and not just to create chaos. And Republicans seem to be very good about creating chaos at the border, chaos on the House floor, and chaos wherever they go. Americans want us to make sure we have a pathway for dreamers, that we address the agricultural workers, and that we also secure the border. That's something that Democrats are determined and working to do, and we're looking for good Republican co-sponsors with us on that. I don't know, is there anything else you wanted to add, Ranking Member? If not, then I yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for questions.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. How nice to see you in that chair. I'd walked in and I thought we were going to be talking about having the Congress dictate to a local district what to do with the criminal laws so that people who are not elected by those residents would be dictated. And here we are talking about things like immigration around a D.C. sort of bill where we're not respecting local decisions, right? It strikes me that when my colleague kind of goes on about immigrants in his state, he fails to realize that those immigrants in his state are basically keeping up the economy, right? They are working in the jobs that American citizens don't take. And so, and we had recent reports from Social Security how thank you, immigrants, because without your participation in Social Security, we would not be solvent for a few more years. We need to do a lot. Social Security 2100, I'm in on that bill, so we could fix it. But it also strikes me that I walked in on the debate just as, I just was wondering what was being picked in your state. It's turnips, collard greens, kale. Those are the kinds of things that, hard-working immigrants, undocumented and documented, pick. Backbreaking work. But criminal conduct it strikes me that the only reason you get indicted is because there is probable cause and lots of hard work to say we think we might convict you in front of a jury. Now, some of those cases against the former president have not gone forward, and I know that the work that you're doing in oversight and judiciary aren't going forward, mostly because there just isn't any there, right? And we had a whole, they've had months and months to look at this, and we haven't seen anything. I really don't have any questions because
would you yield, Ms. Leger?
Sure, dear colleague.
Okay, let me just, you say they're carrying their own weight. I really don't know how you're saying that. In South Carolina, education cost alone is $586 million. Police and legal corrections, $135 million. There was an article in the Epoch Times, the small towns, particularly in Texas, where all border states are being deluged with, and in Mr. Nadler's state, New York. Look at what they've done to education system there. It's unsustainable. And I don't know how you say they're carrying their own weight. The fact that each household in South Carolina, they don't make these things up. It's $377 per household annually. So all I would say is, if you asked, you say that I can't imagine legal immigration everybody is for. You got to have some way to monitor who's coming in your house. And as Mike Pompeo said, they're in the gates now. We got over 40,000 Chinese nationals.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. And I would point out that we actually had a bill, bipartisan bill, the modernization workforce bill, and the farm worker modernization workforce bill, which Republicans killed. But going back to the issue at hand, like I said, I didn't really have any questions. We seem to have veered off from the topic, but I don't know if you want to respond to anything you heard.
There is one thing, Congresswoman Leger Fernandez, thank you very kindly, and I love the freewheeling nature of the Rules Committee. I wasn't prepared to talk about the immigration issue, but the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina raised an issue that's close to my heart because it's something I worked on when I was a state senator, which is organized rings of retail theft. And in Maryland, we passed a law against directing organized retail theft. And I suppose that's something you'd be interested in. I mean, it's these criminal rings that are sending people in and robbing stores and coming out. I don't know if the gentleman is aware that that's precisely the kind of legislation that would be invalidated by the bill before you. The District of Columbia Council just passed that and created new criminal sentences under it. There's nothing in this legislation that deals with that particular offense, but that's something that has come up and that's been something we've been troubled by in Maryland and I'm sure other states. You want to have the local government being able to respond to those things. But what this legislation says is that the District of Columbia Council cannot alter in any way. It cannot increase criminal sentences. It can't reduce criminal sentences. It can't create new crimes with sentences just because Congress knows best. And that seems dubious to me, and it seems like a massive intervention with home rule and a real diss to the people of Washington who've been going through the process of responding to these kinds of criminal events. So I just thought you should know about that. There are jurisdictions that are taking action on precisely the problem that you identified. Please, by all means.
I yield you time, Mr. Norman.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you respond when the mayor, Merrill Bowser, would not intervene with, I forget which campus, maybe it was in George Washington, to stop the peaceful protests that were tearing up buildings? Why would she not lend the police force to help that out, help the college out?
Well, as I understand it, she sent the police in, and they broke up the encampment. That's my understanding. We were going to have a hearing on the whole thing, but the chairman canceled it. So I don't know any more details other than the D.C. police did go in.
It was after 14 days, and only after we were going to hold a hearing and make her have to answer questions to the American people as to why they weren't adhering to the request of the university president. The George Washington University president requested that the police go in and remove the encampments. These were peaceful protests, but they were trespassing. They were intimidating Jewish students, and 20+% of the student population at George Washington is Jewish. And they were begging for help from the police department, and they didn't until the morning of the hearing. They finally cleared it out, which the hearing was going to be 100% about why Washington hadn't cleared that encampment out. And that's why the hearing was canceled. But I would be curious as to what the ranking member's position. Did you support?
I thought the hearing was about anti-Semitism too,
No,
which is why I was so
it was
disappointed.
the
I didn't think it was just about that one event. Well, that's why I was so disappointed that you canceled it.
What did you support? Whose side were you on? The university president side requesting help from Washington D.C. police, or the mayor's
I
side?
think the
Did you
witnesses
support
should be
the mayor's
questioning each
decision?
other. We have
I'm happy to answer the question if someone else
It is-
proposes it.
it is Ms. I think I'll
Leger
reclaim my
Fernandez.
time on this, but this is an example. It is freewheeling, but it is an example of how we have moved beyond the idea that we are imposing on D.C. From Congress what should be happening. And I think it's up to the local voters.
Yes.
Do they want to continue electing council members and a mayor who are pursuing these policies?
And in that
That's up to them,
specific
isn't it?
case, there are, I think, something like 5,000 or 6,000 college and university campuses across the country, and they and their security forces have relationships with the local governments and the county governments and the state governments. They can't be micromanaged by the U.S. Congress. We're the federal legislature, and we're supposed to be engaged in federal lawmaking. So if there was a request from a campus to the D.C. police and to the mayor, and they engaged in a process that at first didn't give the university exactly what it wanted, and then it did end up doing it, I'd be happy to look at it, but that's how local government works, right? And does the Congress really want to be superintending the relationship between every college and university in all of our districts and the local and state governments? I don't think so. And to get back to the matter at hand, that's precisely the fatal flaw with this legislation, which is it says for all time, we're going to freeze criminal sentencing legislation in the District of Columbia at what it is. I don't know whether that was deliberate or not, but that's what their legislation says. They're going to make it impossible for the D.C. Council to do what it just did, which is to create new crimes like the crime of organized retail theft conspiracy rings. And that's not something that the Congress of the United States is going to do for D.C., but it's something that D.C. did for itself, but now we wouldn't allow them to, simply because we decide it's an election year and it's convenient to kick D.C. around a little bit.
So thank you very much, Ranking Member. And I would note, Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to enter into the record the Washington Post article that points out how Social Security and Medicare taxes have been benefited by immigrant participation.
Without objection.
And because it's not my word, these are actually several statistics. We've also looked at, there was a recent GAO study, CBO, which pointed out that immigrants, undocumented immigrants, have produced about $1 trillion of benefit to the United States economy, and we will also, I don't have that one on me right now, but I'll send it over to Mr. Norman's office. And with that, I yield back.
Ms. Leger Fernandez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Fox and Ranking Member Scott. It's great to see you again, Secretary Becerra, although I must admit it was a lot more fun when we were talking about rural health and there was mariachis, great art, and food trucks. But here we are.
Those food trucks aren't bad.
So for too long, and I know you've addressed it here earlier, the country has suffered from opioid epidemic. In 2022, nearly half of young adults aged 18 to 25 had either a mental illness or substance use disorder. I do not want to see another headline of a promising young person lost to overdose. That's why I'm introducing and I'm working with the committee around my Campus Prevention and Recovery Services for Students Act, Right now, colleges must operate programs to support students struggling with addiction. My bill makes sure those programs are evidence-based and the Department of Education coordinates with SAMHSA. Secretary Becerra, can you tell us why we need to focus on evidence-based programs to address addiction and how SAMHSA can be a key partner to the Department of Education and these schools?
Congressman, thank you for the work you do here, because what we're finding, and we probably have anecdotal evidence in our own homes, that oftentimes young people don't connect the facts with what they're doing, what they're seeing. So they think it may not be a problem if you have 4 or 5 drinks, and that's not going to cause you any issues. Or they may not believe that there may be harm if you're taking particular drugs, even something like marijuana. And so it's important that we have data that shows what the true facts are, so we can present that to our children so they have a better understanding of what might come before them.
Thank you. And working with SAMHSA will be key for us. At the CHC on the Road event, we had extensive discussion on the risk of closures of rural hospitals. Over 30% of all rural hospitals in the country are at risk of closing. In my district alone, Alta Vista Regional closed its labor and delivery unit. Portales, the Roosevelt General Hospital, reduced its staff hours. One bright spot, however, is HRSA's Delta Region Community Health Systems, which provides assistance to strengthen local healthcare systems across the Mississippi Delta region. But HRSA doesn't currently fund similar grants in any Western rural communities. Secretary Becerra, do you think that Western rural states like Nuevo Mexico would benefit from a similar program, and how can we work together to make that happen?
One of the things that the President Biden has done is given us opportunities and resources to focus on rural healthcare systems because, as you said, they are very stressed. But we could use more support to make that happen. And so you mentioned the Delta Region Community Health Systems Program, which has been very successful. I suspect there are other regions in the country similar in scope that could also benefit. So I'll be more than willing to work with you on something like that.
Okay, we'll look at that. I know it comes down to funding as well. And we need to remember, and people on this committee need to remember, when we want to support some of the positive programs that you've heard on both sides of the dais here, it takes resources. We both grew up in bilingual households and understand the importance of making sure our workforce is culturally and linguistically competent. In my district alone, 34% of households speak a non-English language at home. And we know immigrants get the job done, right? We are vital to our future success as a nation, including adding $7 trillion to the economy in the next 10 years, $7 trillion, and $1 trillion in government revenue, right? We're paying taxes. We are key. Immigrants are key to our success. So we must make sure that we can also serve them in our medical environments, take care of their health care because they so often take care of us. Can you share with us how IHHS is expanding the number of bilingual physicians?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. And as a son of immigrants, I can attest to what you just said. And what we are trying to do is make sure that as we expand the network of especially community health centers, that they are able to provide the services that are needed by the populations around them. And so more and more, we're finding that to offer the linguistically and culturally competent care that's required, you really do need to bring in a workforce that can do that immediately. And so we're trying to support those efforts to try to bring in more physicians, more nurses, more healthcare providers who come from communities that are often disadvantaged. And we're also trying to make sure that we support services so that the communication between those communities and the healthcare providers are sufficient, because sometimes if the communication is not sufficient, the wrong information gets passed or insufficient information gets passed, and you could have terrible health outcomes. And so we know that there's a lot of work that we can do.
Thank you very much. Indeed, bilingualism is a superpower, and I want to thank you for that work. My time has expired, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Leger Fernandez. Mr. Bean, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. A very good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Welcome back. I've got my very first question is something that unites.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and I'll recognize Ms. Leger Fernandez for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Director Stone Manning and Director Sams and Comptroller Brown for being here today. Thank you very much, actually, for the hard work that you've put in that I think this paper recognizes, right? I want to see this as the thousands of public comments that you have received, the careful study of how do we protect our public lands and our public resources, because we must remember those are American resources. They belong to us. And in order to figure out how to best go along protecting them, ensuring that we receive the royalties that are due us, that we protect it for those future generations, that we honor the creation that they reflect for those who hold those places sacred, whether from a Christian perspective, a Catholic perspective, or an indigenous perspective. It takes time, and I know you've done that. So I want to start by thanking you for that work. In particular, with regards to the onshore oil and gas leasing rule, royalties make up a really important part of my state's budget. As you know, we have a lot of public lands, we have a lot of federal lands, and we benefit from those oil and gas royalties. Can you describe how drafting the final onshore oil and gas leasing rule, how did you make sure you coordinated with the public, that is, the people who actually own these natural resources, as well as the oil and gas companies who are making record profits right at this time? So you can tell us, can you share a little bit about the coordination, the input you received from both sides?
Congresswoman, thank you so much for the question. And of course, so much in the oil and gas rule that you see before you is implementing what Congress asked us to do through the Inflation Reduction Act, what with the increases of royalty rates. But we held many public meetings, both in person and virtually. We got over 200,000 comments on the rule that we pored over, and the final product is a result of what we heard both from Congress and what we heard from the public.
Thank you very much. And as you can see, 200,000 comments takes up a lot of space. I want to really make sure that we get to an issue that was sort of big picture. I want to get to a little hyper-local issue that I think affects other places as well, the Valles Caldera National Park and the Santa Fe National Forest. As you know, Director Sams, there's been a significant number of cattle that are routinely found in the park. I get a lot of texts and comments about that. In fact, you're going to be hiring wranglers for the next 6 months every day to gather the cattle up. As you know, in the state of New Mexico, we are a fence-out state, meaning landowners are responsible for fencing out livestock if they don't want them on their property. Well, I know you're not subject to those federal laws. It is a tradition, and it is important to make sure that we do the maintenance ahead so you do not have to have 6 months of wranglers in the park, and so that we can preserve the resources of the park. So can you tell me can you actually commit to maintain the portions of the Valles Caldera fence within the Park Service's jurisdiction? And let me know what steps you're going to be taking to address challenges or barriers to ensure the proper upkeep of this very important asset.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. You know, I come from a ranching family. I understand the importance of being accountable for your own cattle and or horses. We ran over 300 head of cattle and 100 head of horses. That being said, and recognizing the issues that we face at Valles Caldera, we're working very closely with the U.S. Forest Service on a management plan for that. We're looking at how exactly we can continue to build the fence out, and then the responsibilities each of us will have on maintaining that fence. I'm happy to get that information and more specifics on that back to you directly in writing.
Well, thank you. And I think this need to coordinate with all kinds of different agencies and jurisdictions, including the ranchers, including the Forest Service, making sure that what we're looking at is bringing back, both on Forest Service land, the health of the grazing lands, and then keeping those fences up. Good fences make good neighbors. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields, and I just mentioned that those are not comments.
But there we reflect the comments.
Those are the new rules that have been proposed by the Bureau of Land Management during the Biden administration.
Well, thank you. I just was pointing out that I'm sure that they reflect the comments that they've received, the 200,000 on just one rule. So thank you very much for the clarification, Mr. Chair.
Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Stone Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. McGovern, for pointing out the importance of choosing our leaders wisely and choosing those who would reject tyrannical tendencies themselves or to ally themselves with tyrants. Because this reminds me that 250 years ago, when the revolutionaries of our American soil decided to fight to escape the tyrannical and authoritarian rule of the king, some pushed back. They were concerned that the people of the beautiful experiment we call America would not be able to choose the right leader. Samuel Adams believed that virtue was the soul of democracy. He said these beautiful words, I quote, "A moral people will elect moral leaders," end quote. A moral people will elect moral leaders. I have incredible faith in our American people. I know that they honor and cherish our Constitution. I know that the American people will honor the rule of law. Today, I will not speak of the 34 reasons why I know that the American people are a moral people and will elect moral leaders. Today, instead, I will speak about the manner in which Americans not just cherish virtue, rule of law, and our Constitution, Americans also cherish our veterans and our military. The appropriations bill the Republicans have presented today does not cherish or honor the sacrifices of our service members made in battle for this country. Instead, it sacrifices our national security to industries and lobbyists who don't want us to even acknowledge climate change. The Republican speaker last night actually recognized that it would be common sense to protect our bases from sea rise and flooding. But this bill strips funding for climate resilience. They would sacrifice our military readiness for climate denialism. This bill is a kitchen sink of culture wars rather than one that honors our service members and veterans. Instead of focusing on what our military bases need for readiness, Republicans are attacking women's health care, promoting discrimination against LGBTQ veterans, and denying climate change. This appropriations bill will prevent women veterans from receiving reproductive health care wherever she may live. If a veteran woman's health is at risk during her pregnancy, Republicans don't want her to get VA care in the full way that she may need it. If she lives in Texas, Alabama, or a state that took away her reproductive health care, she might find herself waiting in an emergency room parking lot until she is near death. I've made difficult decisions about life-threatening conditions during my own pregnancies. I enjoyed the right to make decisions about my health with the people I trust and love, my doctors, and my own faith in God. I want every woman to have the same right to have access to health care if her health is at risk during pregnancy, especially if she is a veteran who has served our country. Veterans, all veterans, deserve our respect wherever they live. That respect is measured by action, actions that protect health care access. This bill does not show that respect. I urge my colleagues to oppose the rule, and I yield back. Disproportionately impacts women and LGBTQ plus student athletes. That's just a fact. They get harassed more, they get assaulted more. That's why I applauded the Biden administration's update to the Title IX regulations. Let's all remember, the Trump administration passed regulations making it easier for those who discriminate against and harass student athletes, especially women athletes, especially LGBTQ athletes, to get away with it. They made it easier for those predators to harass and attack our student athletes. This is not surprising, given the fact that a key figure in the Trump administration has to pay $88.3 million in verdicts arising from a sexual assault and subsequent defamation. If the leader of the former administration was found guilty of sexual assault, how could we expect that administration to protect student athletes from sexual assault? So I'm very grateful that the Biden administration adopted a new regulation that honors Title IX, which restores and expands protections for women and LGBTQ student athletes. This regulation recognizes that they are the most at risk for harassment and bullying. Sadly, this legislation to overturn the Biden rule is just another piece of Republicans' attack on women and LGBTQ, trans, and the most vulnerable student athletes. And with that, I will yield back, and thank you very much for coming. But Mr. Scott, is there anything else you would like to add to this?
Yeah, the this rule did not include provisions on athletics. That's still being considered in the department, and that rule will be coming out later. But when you talk about athletics, that is a very complicated situation, but it's not dealt with in this rule.
Yields back. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you. I very much enjoyed my time on House administration and on the subcommittee on elections. Boy, what a difference there is when you change from Democrats to Republicans, right? You were not there, ranking member, but the chair and I sat through many a hearing when we talked about how wonderful it was that we had actually had an increase in voter participation in 2020. And my thought was, why don't we get very excited about that and make it easier and make sure that more Americans vote, right? Because that is democracy. We just celebrated the 4th of July. We should make it easier for American citizens to vote. And instead, we have this bill, which would make it harder for American citizens to vote. So you wonder why. Is it because the 2020 general election featured both the most Americans voting, but the Republican candidate lost? You know, because this bill goes after the communities that helped President Biden win. For example, polling of military personnel in 2020 showed that they didn't trust Trump as commander-in-chief, and many were shifting from voting Republican to voting for Biden. Mr. Chair, I'd like to enter into the record the 2020 NBC article. Trump says the military will vote for him, but he lost their support long ago. Trump treats the armed forces as just another entity he can manipulate for political purposes. That's alienated the troops and the top brass alike, close quote.
Without objection.
So this bill would make it harder for military personnel to sign up and vote. Our men and women in uniform, you know, they give up so much. They travel, they're away from home, it's not easy to vote. And you touched upon this earlier, ranking member, but what's your reaction when you see Republicans making it harder for military to vote? And do you see any good reason in treating our military that way?
I can, I think I articulated the barriers that would exist, and it's certainly not only for the military, although it does raise a number of questions, but just the kind of burdens that would now be placed on people simply to register to vote when there is scant evidence that there is any concern, despite what people say. There's not a concerted effort that I'm aware of to have non-U.S. citizens register because, frankly, you'd be putting them in harm's way. Just the registration is illegal, and certainly voting is subject to criminal penalties as well as deportation. It simply doesn't happen. In fact, the George Mason study, which was referenced, has been completely debunked by experts in the field of statistical survey data, and it's been debunked by so many different experts. And in the decade since the report was published, its authors have not published a defense of their research work and nothing has made it through a peer review that survives any serious scrutiny. So there is, despite, anybody can put out a paper, I guess, but when it's debunked by experts who looked at the survey data, I think it begs the question. And when you don't, and when you don't rebut that criticism, I think that says a great deal. But this, to your point, and I think this is a really important point, which is the problem in America is not too many people voting, it's that participation still lags behind. I mean, when half of the eligible people in an American election vote, register and vote, I think that says a great deal. We should be making this easier for people to access the ballot, not more difficult. And frankly, the amount of documentary evidence that this bill anticipates is extraordinary. I doubt that every Republican in the House has read through the amount of barriers and hurdles you would now have to register to vote.
Right, and when we're talking about military participate at a lower level anyway, right? They put their lives on the line, but because it's so difficult, they participate at about 27% points lower than the regular American voter. And you're going to make it harder for them? Really? So Native Americans, right? Native Americans are also targeted, in essence, by this bill. And we know that Native Americans in Arizona helped President Biden win that state. The Arizona law that was attempting to depress that vote, one of the court cases I remember said it was like us taking a scalpel to the communities that helped fuel President Biden's win in Arizona. Native Americans and Latinos. You were in Arizona. You were in New Mexico, weren't you? So tell us some of the stories that you heard.
Well, look, I did. Thank you for that. I released just today a report on voting for Native peoples, barriers and policy solutions. Not only did I spend time in Arizona and New Mexico meeting with tribal leaders and tribal members, but staff has spent a great deal of time traveling around the country. There are significant barriers to tribal residents voting, which are detailed in the report. I would encourage people to read it. I mean, these are the first Americans, and they have been treated, despite the Citizenship Act, which is, we celebrated its 100th passage and enactment, still enormous barriers. This will only make it more difficult, as you know, and tribal IDs will no longer be accepted because they don't meet the standard in the new bill in terms of registration.
Right, so Native Americans, the first Americans, right, who are clearly citizens, who didn't get the citizenship until about 100 years ago, and we're still making it hard? We are still making it hard? Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record the report.
Without objection.
So, it is just outrageous that we would do that. And then it hurts me a lot. I represent a rural district. And rural districts, like voting absentee and voting by mail is important in rural areas. In November, the snow comes and a lot of people like to register and participate by mail and absentee. And it makes sense, right? And this will make that harder. Is that correct, Ranking Member?
Well, excuse me, it absolutely would. In many states, mail-in voting has been the standard for decades and decades without any alarm bells ringing that there's been any fraud involved. Arizona, 85% of voters vote by mail. States like Oregon and Colorado have long traditions of mail-in voting. If you're a rural resident in the United States, very often long distances between you and polling places. So mail, telephone, the internet, wherever possible, are the ways that you conduct your daily life. These will make most of these activities impossible as it relates to voting. So it just makes it, again, more difficult. It would prevent rural Americans from registering to vote by mail or online, requires an applicant to present documentary proof of citizenship in person at the office of an appropriate election official. That's in the bill. It would force millions of rural Americans who have registered to vote online or via mail to travel significant distance to present documents to government officials, something they currently have to do, they don't have to do, and have not had to do for decades now. And I do want to mention, 48% of Americans don't have passports, one of the forms of citizenship that the bill suggests. this is an insurmountable barrier to many people who would try to register for the first time, and it would burden rural voters who often have limited access to the types of government offices that you would find in urban settings that would help them access the documentary proof of citizenship, like passport services. So even if you wanted to get a passport, it's difficult to get to the offices. So it is voter suppression that targets rural Americans, hurts military personnel, hurts women who have changed their name as a result of marriage. I mean, students, you name it, the list is long of people who would be burdened by these new requirements.
And when we look at what was the coalition that led to the victory for Biden, these are the kinds of people, and this is the kind of voting that led to that, and they are under attack. You know, this week of July 4th and celebrating freedom and democracy, democracy does not exist without strong voter participation, and it's shameful and unpatriotic when Republicans take aim at voter participation. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Ranking Member?
Well, just that, again, our goal ought to be to make sure every single American, every citizen in this country has access to the ballot. Sadly, too few do, too few participate, and putting more burdens on them is unacceptable if our goal is to make sure every single American is heard at the ballot box and that their votes count. That's what we ought to be focused on. I think that's what the Congress ought to be doing. That's what the Freedom to Vote Act does. That's why we offered it as amendments. Sadly, it wasn't deemed in order under the closed rule, but we'll keep fighting for it.
Right. And the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act used to be bipartisan. It passed 98-0 last time. And now Republicans have abandoned the Voting Rights Act. And that is once again in this month of celebrating our anniversary as a country that is founded on democracy. It is both shameful and unpatriotic. And I oppose this rule and bill. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you very much. You know, we had to rush over last night to an emergency rules committee to engage in this emergency resolution. This is an emergency. It's Republican panic. House Republicans are afraid of Vice President Harris. House Republicans are afraid of the energy and the excitement Vice President Harris inspires in Americans. She is a new generation of a leader who is bringing us a vision of prosperity and opportunity for all Americans. They are afraid of that vision. They are afraid of the vision because she has been fighting for working families, for unions, for women who want reproductive freedom. Vice President Harris' vision stands in stark contrast to the vengeful and hateful policies House Republicans and their nominee propose. Republicans and their nominee want to divide Americans, while Vice President Harris wants to unite Americans. She wants to make sure she fights for reproductive freedom for women. She will fight to make sure that we have access to contraception, to IVF, but what does the dark vision of the Republicans and their Project 2025 propose? They propose a national abortion ban. They propose restricting women's ability to make their own choices. They propose controlling Americans, controlling women. And let's talk about immigration, since that is in the title of this. For decades, House Republicans have been the ones who block many meaningful immigration and border bills. They refuse to participate in bipartisan solutions, which we know are necessary for immigration and the border. Bipartisan. Congress, we're the ones who must act. This year, Vice President Harris, along with President Biden, Democrats and Senate Republicans, made a deal on immigration reform and border security. Then former President Trump asked them to kill the border deal, and so House Republicans did. They declared it dead on arrival in the House. House Republicans don't have a real solution for the border because they don't actually want to fix it. If they did, what would they talk about? Because everything they propose is dark. It is always siding with the billionaires and the richest corporations instead of the working families. You know what? I am excited by Vice President Harris. It is telling how scared the Republicans are of our nominee for president. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman.
Ms. Leger Fernandez.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Ranking Member McGovern, to pointing out what we heard last night. This is all political theater. That's what we heard last night. That's what we're hearing on the floor today. But is that what I heard when I was in New Mexico? No, in New Mexico, what I heard in the fields and at the markets was ranchers and farmers actually anxiously asking about the Farm Bill. What I heard was veterans who marched in the Bean Day Parade describing how their health would suffer dramatically if we don't pass a VA supplemental. Families told me they want Congress to work together on a bipartisan matter, which this is not. They want us to work together to make their lives better. We have 12 legislative days to do Congress's basic job: fund the government, fund veterans programs, fund emergency programs, pass a farm bill. Instead of funding our nation's obligations, the Republicans are toying with a government shutdown yet again. Instead, the Republicans' Armed Service Committee chair called this temporary funding terrible. Your own chair of Armed Services called this, quote, terrible. Their CR also fails to fund disaster relief as wildfires, hurricanes, and floods devastate the countryside. Businesses and neighbors in New Mexico and across the country won't get the emergency relief they deserve unless Congress funds FEMA. Instead of living up to their obligations, Republicans are using this funding deadline to make it harder for American citizens to vote. They've included their voting restriction bill as a poison pill on this CR. What is the real-life consequence of their voting restriction bill? With a military ID, you can fight and die for this country, but Republicans won't let you use it alone to register to vote. Why would House Republicans make it harder for service members, for recently married or divorced women, for Native Americans, and for rural Americans to register and vote? Republicans and their presidential campaigners are fabricating a lie that non-citizens vote to sow fear and distrust of our elections. They are pushing their Project 2025 agenda today. New Mexicans don't want us to make it harder for them to vote. They are concerned about how hard it is to live. Yesterday, in the Rules Committee, a Republican witness said, "We could wait until later to take care of veterans funding." Why wait? Instead of do-nothing messaging bills and a politicized CR that's going nowhere, we should prioritize our veterans now. We should prioritize disaster relief funding now. We should pass a farm bill that helps our rural communities now. This rule fails our military. It fails our veterans, families, and neighbors. I urge a no vote now on this rule, and I yield back.
Times, and I feel compelled. In fact, I think this committee has an obligation to allow me to respond to the things that have been said.
Up to a point.
Mm-hmm.
Just to back and forth, I'm not
Can I have some
interested
time to respond?
No, I'm not going to.
Okay.
Can I, they say this was a success. Really?
Yeah.
Really. And what's the fallout here? Americans left behind. Thousands of ISIS K are released from Bagram, some of whom have found their way into this country. That's the fallout. And what else? Putin invades Ukraine. Chairman Xi threatens the Pacific. The Ayatollah raises his ugly head. Projection of weakness invites aggression, conflict, and war. This was the beginning of a failed foreign policy.
Weakness and appeasement. Thank you all for testifying. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Crow, we heard several statements that didn't seem to comport with what happened on the ground. It seems to me like Trump negotiated a pretty bad agreement, and then they want to forget about that. And the idea that Trump left it all stable. Why don't you respond to some of the issues that you just heard?
Well, thank you, Ms. Leger Fernandez. First of all, I mean, this proceeding is another example. They literally don't want to talk about the issue, and they don't want to hear from people who have facts that would run contrary, right? They cherry-picked facts from their purported investigation. They make claims in this hearing and then don't allow me to respond to them. They are doing it through the Rules Committee instead of having a hearing that we could hold tomorrow, because we actually have a scheduled hearing tomorrow, and we could have this debate. So they just don't want the truth, and that's pretty clear. But a couple of things that I think are really important, and there's more than we have time to dispel. But a couple of things. I did not co-chair the investigation. I was the ranking member of the Oversight and Accountability Subcommittee on the Foreign Affairs Committee. This is the subcommittee that the majority established to conduct the bulk of the investigation, or their purported investigation into Afghanistan. And as the ranking member of that subcommittee, I never saw a draft report. In fact, I didn't see the report until it was publicly released. I had no say in their report, nor did they ever at any time engage with any of the minority staff or members in putting the report together. So that's just one illustration of many as to how this is a partisan hit job and not an effort to try to get to the truth. And that's the fact. And no, Afghanistan was not stable in January in 2021. Not only were there the lowest number of U.S. troops since 2001, but the Taliban had been advancing and taking territory since 2013. In fact, the U.S. military commander, General Scott Miller, in charge of all U.S. troops for the years leading up to 21 and during, testified that it was, quote, a slow bleed, end quote. We were losing. And Joe Biden had only two options left. Donald Trump gave him only two options because he didn't have enough troops on the ground. And all the military commanders said very clearly that if he had broken the Trump agreement with the Taliban, an agreement, by the way, that Donald Trump negotiated without the Afghan government, that gave no talk or no allocation for human rights or the rights of women, doesn't speak about that at all in the agreement, and actually says that the Afghan government had to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. That's what Trump agreed to. That further destabilized the situation on the ground. That's what Joe Biden was facing. Either go back to war with the Taliban and surge troops in, however many, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000.
Let me just ask a question. So Trump negotiated agreement that called for the release of the Taliban prisoners.
Correct.
And when were they released?
They were released, they started to be released in 2020.
Right, so they were released under Trump.
Correct.
So Trump negotiated an agreement that releases all of these Taliban prisoners
Correct.
into society. Trump negotiates, from what you're telling me, Trump negotiates an agreement that brings down the troops to a slow bleed to very dangerous levels for the rest of the American troops. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's right.
Okay, so those are the facts of what was happening during Trump. It was not stable, is what you've now described.
Donald Trump's agreement agreed to the closure of bases, the reduction of troops and contractors, the release of Taliban prisoners, gave no accommodation whatsoever or requirement for human rights or the protection of women and girls, and completely excluded the Afghan government from those negotiations.
And does this resolution make reference to any of Trump's excellent negotiating skills in terms of, that sounds like a pretty lousy negotiating deal for America?
It simply references the agreement, but it talks about none of the components we just talked about.
So, and are there any other elements that you want to correct with regards to the exchange that has taken place?
Yeah, one other thing, one of your colleagues mentioned something about $7 billion of weapons and equipment that were left behind. That number actually is the entirety of U.S. military weapons and equipment given to the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces over the entire 20 years of the war, right? Much of it destroyed in combat, much of it beyond its useful life, much of it left unserviceable after contractors and servicing and maintenance were not provided for. That is the entirety. So to take that number and to say that what was left in the hands of the Taliban is just completely misleading.
So the statement about the $7 billion, that was given to the Afghanis, so it was no longer our equipment? Is that what I'm
That's
understanding?
right. In fact, General Milley and General Miller testified very clearly during the transcribed interviews that the United States military took all of its equipment with them.
Is there anything else that you want to correct in the record?
Well, there's more than I think we have time for this evening, but certainly that's a good start.
There's no clock in the Rules Committee.
You're sure? This is it. This is the last Democrat that gets to ask questions.
You know, this notion that the withdrawal, by the way, a lot of the challenges of the withdrawal, many of them, occurred because President Ghani fled the country. After President Ghani fled the country, which nobody anticipated, by the way, nobody thought that was going to happen. And I've spent much of my adult life either serving in Afghanistan, focused on Afghanistan issues. Nobody saw that coming. And then that led to the precipitous collapse of the Afghan military and the police forces, which then led to a very challenging withdrawal environment in that month. But there's no evidence that shows the situation on the ground and the challenges at the airport in August of 2021 were avoidable. And that or let me be clear, that the attack on Abbey Gate and the death of those 13 members was avoidable. In fact, the Department of Defense's own investigation showed very clearly that there was never a positive ID of the bomber, and nobody knew who that person was. And the majority's assertion that reliance on the Taliban to run checkpoints is somehow related to that ignores the reality that the Taliban and the ISIS are actually sworn mortal enemies and continue to try to kill each other to this day. And in fact, the reliance on Taliban checkpoints made our troops safer, because instead of having to guard the outer perimeter and maintain those checkpoints, we were able to be in an inner perimeter. So these are many, many things that are false or misleading in this resolution, and I would urge my colleagues to not support it.
Thank you. I think that anytime we have the loss of life, and especially in incidents like that, it's very sad and it's hard for the country. It is unfortunate when it gets used in such a partisan and politicized manner like this. And with that, Mr. Chair, I will yield back.